Hello fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're listening on a long walk under soft skies, watching while dinner simmers on the stove, or drifting slowly towards sleep, you're in the right place. Because tonight, we're entering the deep, quiet story of how humans first learned to farm. This is contemplative storytelling for the endlessly curious. It's an untold epic of the struggle for food, a journey across 10,000 years, whispered through frost, fire, and seed. But it's not the simple tale of progress you might expect. It doesn't begin with a plough, but with a pause. Oh, and if you're someone who appreciates calm, science-based storytelling, look just below the video. There's a button there that says subscribe. If you press it, you'll always know when a new story arrives. You can unsubscribe at any time, and there's a little bell icon next to it, tapping, that lets you know the moment new episodes appear. That support really matters. This channel depends on subscribers to keep creating these stories. And I wonder, where are you right now? What time is it for you? If you feel like sharing, leave a note in the comments. It's a quiet reminder. We're all listening together, and if you drift off, that's perfectly fine. There are chapter markers below if you want to return later. Now, let's begin with a world before planting, a time of silence, a hunger, a hope. Before the plough, before the seed, before the field, there was the long, quiet wandering. For nearly all of human time, our species did not farm. It did not plant. It did not stay. It moved with the rhythm of rivers and animals and the sky. And so, when we ask how humans learned to farm, we must begin not with the planting of a seed, but with the decision to carry none at all. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans survived without the safety of storage or the promise of next season's crop. They endured by reading the land like a sacred text. Every valley a verse, every gust of wind a quiet sentence, every animal track a fleeting footnote. What kind of mind does it take to live this way? Not by shaping the world, but by listening to it? They travelled in small bands, 12, 15, maybe 30 souls. There were no cities. No permanent homes. Their possessions could be carried on their backs or bundled in skins. They knew each other's footsteps, their laughter, their dreams. Fire was their gathering point, their warmth, their memory keeper. At night they sat close around its glow, not for leisure, but because beyond its ring was danger and silence. Stories were told, not written, not carved, but spoken, and in them lived the knowledge of thousands of years. Which root could kill, which bark could heal, which river's edge revealed the footprints of game. These stories were their textbooks, their maps, their medicine, and over time these oral threads wove a tapestry of deep, inherited knowledge, passed from old voice to young ear, generation after generation, with more accuracy than any scroll. Their tools were made of stone, bone, and wood, crafted with slow care, shaped not only by function but by memory. A flint scraper might be handed down from grandparent to child, its edge sharpened not just against antler, but against time itself. These tools were not crude. They were precise, designed to skin a hide cleanly, to carve meat from bone, to shave fibres for rope or nets. They were the extensions of human thought, ideas you could hold in your hand. And when you hold a stone blade from 20,000 years ago, you are not holding something primitive. You are holding intelligence made visible. What does it say about us that we mastered survival, not by dominating, but by adapting? Not by ruling nature, but by learning to move within it? Their lives followed the movement of animals, caribou, mammoth, wild sheep. They followed the herds through vast and changing landscapes, timing their migrations with uncanny precision. And they knew the plants too, when wild onions would bloom, when berries would soften with sweetness, when acorns could be leached to make them safe. Every season had its gifts, but only if you arrived at the right moment. Too soon, and you would find nothing. Too late, and the bounty would be gone. So they watched the moon. They watched the birds. They listened to the earth beneath their feet. How many years of observation does it take to feel time moving not in clocks, but in blossoms and migrations? And the world they moved through was a world of ice and fire. During the Upper Paleolithic, Earth swayed in and out of glacial grip. Vast sheets of ice reached down from the poles, grinding mountains into dust, draining the oceans, locking moisture into frozen kingdoms. Where ice did not dominate, wind did, carving open steppes and plains, sweeping cold and silence across the continents. In these regions, life did not vanish. It adapted. Humans did too. They made shelters of mammoth bone, stitched clothing from reindeer hide, and insulated themselves not just against the cold, but against the unpredictability of life itself. What does resilience look like when the sun disappears for months at a time? But these ice ages were not still. They pulsed. Warm periods would arrive, brief intermissions when the glaciers receded, when forests returned, when lakes spilled over and rivers changed course. And with every shift, humans had to decide stay or move. Often they moved. They carried with them knowledge written not on paper, but in pathways. This path leads to a hidden spring. That ridge shelters deer in the late autumn. That grove grows the small purple fruit that feeds us when the snow melts. These were not guesses. These were certainties, born from generations of careful attention. And yet even certainties could falter. A storm that came too early, a herd that changed direction, a fire that did not catch. What happens when all your knowledge is right and nature still says no? We tend to think of prehistory as chaotic, but the people who lived it sought pattern. They were students of repetition. They knew that beneath the apparent randomness of weather and beast, there were deeper rhythms. And it is here, perhaps, that the first quiet seeds of agriculture were planted, not in soil, but in mind. Because to plant a seed, one must believe in tomorrow. One must believe that time loops, that the future will echo the past. And hunter-gatherers were beginning to feel those echoes. They knew which valleys greened first in spring. They knew which fruit trees gave more yield every third year. They may not have had calendars, but they had memory, and memory was enough. Even the sky became a teacher. In some Upper Paleolithic sites, we find bone carvings with notches that match the lunar cycle. We find alignments of stones that might mark solstices or equinoxes. These were not idle decorations. They were instruments, tools of orientation in a world without cities or clocks. By reading the stars, by tracking the moon's rise and fall, these early humans could predict when the salmon would run, when the geese would fly, when the grasses would seed. How many nights must you lie awake staring at the stars before you begin to hear them speaking? And as they move through this ever-shifting world, they were not alone. Other humans moved too. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, mysterious peoples now lost to name but still faintly traceable in our DNA. They all walked the same windswept ridges, hunted the same wary prey, warmed themselves by the same uncertain fire. And sometimes they met. And when they met, they exchanged more than tools. They exchanged genes. They exchanged knowledge. They exchanged stories, perhaps, or glances of recognition across the ice. What does it mean that our ancestors learned not just from the land, but from each other? Cooperation became the most powerful tool of all. Hunting large game required coordination. Flanking, trapping, communicating without sound. Gathering required memory. Who knew the place? Who remembered the season? Who could spot danger in a trembling leaf? These groups were not primitive. They were tightly woven tapestries of skill and trust. Elders carried the maps of memory. Children carried the future. Everyone mattered, because survival left no room for excess. There were no strangers, and yet, over the hills, there were always others. Did they feel like enemies, or like the distant reflection of the self? Fire remained their centre, not just for heat or cooking, but for ritual. Some hearths are layered with generations of ash, fireplaces used for centuries in the same spot, their stones blackened by time, their edges worn smooth by the slow press of hands. Around these fires we find ochre, beads, carvings, and buried bones. We find art. Hands painted on cave walls, herds of bison galloping across stone, spirals and lines whose meaning we may never know. Why would a people living hand to mouth take time to paint beauty into darkness? Because beauty was survival too. Not just the survival of the body, but of meaning. When you live with uncertainty, beauty becomes memory's anchor. Art becomes a way to say, we were here, We saw. We felt. In the Chauvet Cave 36,000 years ago, someone painted lions with curved backs and glowing eyes, as if caught mid-step. There was no camera. There was no audience. Just the need to preserve what the eye had seen and the heart had known. What kind of mind sees a world in motion and tries to hold it still? And somewhere within that mind, something else was stirring. Not just memory, but abstraction. It was not enough to know that the rains came after the first frost. It was not enough to recall the spot where tubers grew. The mind began to map connections, cause and effect, time and return, hunger and preparation. Some of the oldest known groundstone tools are not for killing, but for grinding, for pulverizing seeds, roots, and nuts into something new. They were not just consuming, they were transforming. When did that transformation stop being just survival and start being intention? We find caches of gathered grain dating back over 20,000 years. In Ohalo 2, a site near the Sea of Galilee, archaeologists uncovered charred seeds arranged carefully, wild barley, wild wheat, and other edible grasses. Next to them grinding stones, next to those hearths. It is not yet agriculture, but it is knowledge, layered and quiet. These people were harvesting wild stands, returning to the same places year after year. They knew the rhythms. They may have even managed the land, cutting back shrubs, encouraging favoured plants. What happens when the land starts remembering you too? And yet they still moved. The great contradiction of this time is that humans began to deepen their relationship with place, without yet surrendering to it. They built seasonal camps, returned to favoured lakes, revisited sacred hills. The land became familiar, but it was not yet owned. There were no fences, no borders, only agreements perhaps, spoken or unspoken, about who could gather where and when. This is a way of being we struggle to imagine now, a relationship to land that is intimate, but not possessive. Can you belong to a place without trying to make it yours? Their calendars were not carved in stone but etched in memory. The sound of frogs in spring, the colour of the sky before the first frost, the direction of the wind in autumn. These were their cues, these were their signs, and in these signs they saw not just survival, but return, a cycle, a trust. The sense that time was not a line, but a circle, and to live within that circle was not a limitation, it was a gift. What kind of freedom is found in knowing you are part of a rhythm that does not need you, but welcomes you? And all the while, the seeds were waiting, carried on the wind, caught in the folds of clothing, tucked unknowingly into baskets, spilled onto soil, forgotten until they sprouted green weeks later. These were not accidents, but invitations to imagine a different kind of future. One where food did not have to be chased, one where the forest could be brought to the village, one where the rhythms of nature could be tuned, just slightly, to human need. How many seasons does it take before observation becomes experimentation? We do not know the name of the first person who planted a seed and stayed to watch it grow. We do not know their face or their language, but we know the conditions that shaped their thought. A world of uncertainty, but not chaos. A world of migration, but not aimlessness. A world of adaptation so refined, so attentive, so deeply woven into place and season that the leap to agriculture was not a revolution, but an awakening. It was not the end of one story, but the transformation of another, a continuity so seamless it's easy to miss. To learn to farm, humans did not invent something entirely new. They deepened something ancient. They took the careful, seasonal wisdom of their ancestors, their knowledge of seeds, soil, wind, and animal paths, and extended it forward in time. They made a bet on continuity, on patience, on the idea that what grows once might grow again, and that we could help it do so. Farming did not emerge from ignorance, it emerged from the accumulation of knowing, and with that knowing came hope and risk, because to plant is to believe, but to believe is to wait. And so we return to the fire, the quiet circle, the hands passing meat and story in equal measure, the eyes watching the stars, the minds connecting pattern to meaning. Here, before the first plough, before the first furrow, before the first wall or field, here is where it begins, the struggle for food. The transformation of the earth, the remaking of the human mind. What happens when a species that has always moved decides to stay? What happens when the rhythm of the wild becomes the rhythm of the field? What shifts in the mind, in the body, in the soul, when a human stops only to rest but begins to stop to remain? Before the walls, before the crops, before the rising smoke of cooking hearths fixed in one place, there was an idea, a quiet one, subtle, like a shadow at the edge of thought. What if the earth itself could be persuaded to feed us? Not just in passing, not just when found, but with intention, predictably, repeatedly, perhaps even willingly. This was not yet agriculture. It was not even planting, but it was pause, it was observation. And in that pause something ancient stirred. Curiosity. Pattern. A whisper of potential in every sprouting stalk. In the wild landscapes of the late Ice Age and its melting aftermath, humans were not yet farmers, but they were watchers, and among the grasses and stones, certain plants made themselves known. Wheat that returned to the same hillside each spring, barley that rustled golden just before the first frost, lentils that clustered beneath the rocks, bursting forth only after rain. They were not sown, they were not stored, but they were remembered. Humans noticed that where they had trodden, where seeds had fallen, plants sometimes grew. They noticed that some stands were more plentiful after a fire had swept through months before. They noticed that harvesting too early left green bitterness, while waiting longer brought starch and strength. And noticing is the first step to change. We imagine the past as blank, but the land was already alive with signals. Certain birds would appear just before a plant flowered. The bark of a nearby tree might darken just before roots softened underground. And people, those wandering bands of skilled observers, began to piece it together. Not by reasoning in a modern sense, but by immersion. They lived close enough to the earth to feel its breath in their bones. Children learned the smell of ripening grain before they learned their own names. Elders could taste the soil and tell what would grow. How many years does it take for a human being to learn not just what a plant is, but what it wants? And in this closeness, another question began to rise, not yet spoken, but felt. Why move when the food returns? Why wander when abundance has a place? At first, it must have seemed like a miracle. A field where they'd gathered last year is now taller, fuller, richer. A patch of soil once empty now brims with sprouts after seeds were dropped. These were gifts, yes, but also hints. The land, it seemed, could be influenced, could be coaxed, could be made to remember. And with that, a new kind of relationship began. Not of dominance, not yet, but of dialogue. Because before farming came conversation, a quiet, seasonal, experimental exchange between people and plants. And it was in this conversation that humanity began to change, not with shovels, but with silence. At sites like Abu Huraira in the Levant, archaeologists have found the remains of tens of thousands of wild seeds, charred and cracked in ancient fire pits. These were not accidents, these were meals. And more than meals, they were evidence of deep preference. Wild corn and barley, ground into flour, baked into cakes, or boiled into porridge. These people were not merely surviving, they were selecting, favouring certain plants, gathering not randomly but with intent, and some of these seeds were kept, not all were eaten. In some settlements we find storage pits, lined with ash, covered with stone, dug deep into the cool earth. Inside, grains, hardened, preserved, waiting. These were vaults, in a world without locks, and what does it mean to keep a seed? It means imagining a future. It means planning. It means understanding that what is not eaten today can be life tomorrow. To store is to trust the return. And trust, as simple as it may sound, is not a given in a world ruled by storms, drought, and famine. What kind of mind dares to save rather than consume? There is evidence that some of these caches were revisited across seasons, that people returned to the same place not because they built walls there, but because something valuable was beneath their feet. Food had begun to leave its imprint not just on the body but on the landscape. These were the first seeds of settlement, not permanent, not enclosed, but cyclical. a pattern of return, and each return taught them more. That grain left in the husk stored longer, that ash deterred insects, that damp ruined the kernel, but dry darkness preserved it. Trial and error, played out over centuries, became tradition, and tradition became ritual. We find in some of these sites ceremonial objects buried with grain, painted stones, tokens, beads pressed into ash. These may have been offerings. They may have been symbols, but they speak to something beyond utility. They speak to reverence. Plants were not simply things to be used. They were partners, perhaps even ancestors. In many early farming cultures we see this echo: grain deities, sprouting gods, the sacredness of soil. Is it possible that the idea of the divine emerged not only from sky and storm, but from the slow unfolding of a seed? And this reverence created another change, a tension, a question that had not been asked before. If the land can give us what we need, why leave it behind? This was not a cry of conquest. It was a murmur, a wondering, a doubt in the necessity of movement. For so long the world had demanded travel. The herds moved, the seasons changed, the fruit came and went. But now, in the embers of stored grain, in the shadow of sprouting fields, there was a promise, a whisper that said, "You don't have to go." The idea must have felt both thrilling and dangerous, because to stay is to risk. To stay is to place your trust in one patch of earth, in one unfolding future. How many times must they have tried and failed? Imagine the scene. A family leaves behind a portion of their gathered seeds. They cover them lightly, mark the spot with a stone. They return moons later. Nothing. Or weeds. Or perhaps a few fragile stalks. But one year, something changes. Rain comes. The sun lingers. And where they expected nothing, there is a small field. Edible. Familiar. The same grain they once chased across hills now stands waiting. This is not domestication, but it is a kind of invitation. And in that moment something else takes root. A question, older than writing. What if we are not just gatherers of what grows, but part of the growing? We see this thought take shape in the archaeological layers of places like Wadi Kubania in Egypt. There, thousands of seeds were not simply dropped. They were processed, soaked, cracked, ground. Human hands had touched them, changed them. There were tools grooved by years of use, hearths, blackened with meals long eaten, and nearby seeds that had clearly sprouted then died, perhaps abandoned, perhaps trampled, or perhaps part of an early experiment. These were not random actions. They were repeated, refined, remembered. And each repetition brought the mind closer to the threshold between taking and tending, between finding and shaping, between hunger and hope. Because with every seed kept, with every sprout noticed, with every return to a patch of familiar ground, humans were redefining their role. No longer just passengers in the great theatre of nature, but subtle choreographers, still subject to its whims but beginning to learn the cues. If this root appears, the rains will follow. If this bird returns, the frost has passed. And in the presence of such signs, a question becomes possible. What if the wild is not something to be chased, but something to be cultivated? And yet, even as this question deepened, many still chose to move, not because they doubted the seed's promise, but because movement was still life's rhythm. Old habits, old roots, elders who remembered where the best springs lay, children who had never known a year without walking, and the earth, generous though it could be, was never predictable, a sudden frost. A plague of locusts, a herd that did not return. Even the best-known stand of barley might fail to sprout one year. So people hedged, they experimented. Some stayed longer, some sent scouts, some split into two bands, one to remain, one to range. It was not yet a revolution, it was a test. And the test was not only logistical, it was spiritual. To move was freedom. To move was safety. To move was who they were. To stop, fully, finally, was to become something else. What does it mean to give up the open sky, the scent of pine on the wind, the long trails etched in memory? What is lost when we choose stability over movement? These questions echo even now. But for those early humans, the choice was not abstract. It was survival. It was weight. It was risk. Still, some did remain. Not all year, not forever, but longer than before, a season, perhaps, two. And in that time they learned more, that sprouts could be protected with brush, that spacing seeds led to stronger stalks, that the best grain came not from the wildest plants, but from those with softer husks, taller stems, easier threshing. These observations were not passive, they were active, incremental. We do not find a moment when agriculture appears fully formed. We find a slow murmur rising over centuries, a pattern emerging in the soil, in the mind, in the way a family might look at a patch of grass and see, not grass, but possibility. And as this possibility grew, the soil itself began to change. Wild plants adapted to human presence. Those with traits that benefited harvest, non-shattering seeds, synchronous ripening, began to dominate. Humans, in turn, adapted to these plants. Their muscles, their teeth, their gut bacteria. This was coevolution, a mutual shaping. And though neither side understood it in any conscious way, a bond was forming, one that would soon become unbreakable. But for now, it was still fragile, still experimental, a dance rather than a contract. And somewhere in the middle of that dance, a child may have asked, "Why do we leave when the food is here?" That question may have been answered with silence, or with a shrug, or with a story from an elder about the storm that once ruined everything, or the great journey of the ancestors, or the danger of staying too long in one place. But the question lingered. It did not disappear. It grew. It passed from voice to voice, from mind to mind, until it was no longer just a question, but a vision of stillness, of permanence, of waking in the same place where the grain grows tall, and when enough people share the same vision, the world begins to shift. We see that shift in sites like Jerf El Ahmar. Long before full-scale farming, people there built circular communal structures, places that suggest not just subsistence but planning, cooperation, shared ritual. We see heavy grinding stones, worn deep. We see storage bins, carefully constructed. We see the first signs of permanence, not of cities not yet, but of people beginning to think in terms of seasons, of cycles, of place. The land was no longer just a backdrop. It was becoming a partner, a teacher, a memory. And memory, once planted, does not stay still. It spreads, it flowers, and eventually it demands roots, not just in the soil, but in the soul. Farming did not begin with the planting of a field. It began with the planting of an idea that food could come not only from the chase but from the wait, that abundance could be coaxed, that time itself could be collaborated with. And in that collaboration, a new kind of human began to emerge, one who watched, one who waited, one who believed not just in the return of the sun or the return of the herd, but in the quiet, miraculous return of something even smaller, a seed, a kernel, a speck of life that, with care and time and just enough rain, might split open and rise. What happens when you believe in something so small? Perhaps you begin to stay. Perhaps you begin to shape the land. Perhaps you begin to become something else entirely. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is when the earth begins to answer back. Not in words, not in sudden revelations, but in heat, in melt, in rising waters. The last great ice age was ending, and it did not go quietly. Across the globe, ancient glaciers, thicker than mountains, older than memory, began to sigh and recede. Their slow retreat redrew the face of continents. Valleys once hidden beneath 100 meters of ice opened to the sun. Lakes burst their icy confines, carving new rivers through stone. The weight of entire worlds lifted, and the earth rose beneath it. What does it mean to awaken in a world that is shifting beneath your feet? This moment, known now as the beginning of the Holocene, was not a single event. It was a long exhale, a warming breath that stretched over millennia. But its effects were anything but gradual in human memory. Floodplains once frozen bloomed into grass. Tundra gave way to forest. Storms shifted. Winds changed. The balance of power in the living world tipped, reshuffled, and began to hum with new tension. And at the centre of it, the humans watched. They did not cause this change, but they would soon be shaped by it. Because when the earth moves, it takes everything with it. The great herds, those vast, thundering masses of mammoth aurochs and reindeer, began to vanish. Not all at once, not everywhere. But their paths grew harder to predict. Some moved north, following the cold. Others dwindled in number, unable to adapt to the new warmth. And as the beasts changed their rhythms, so too did the humans who followed them. A migration was no longer guaranteed. A familiar route might now end in drought or in flood. And with each failed hunt, a question sharpened. How long could we keep moving, if the world itself was leaving us behind? In the wake of the melting, coastlines shifted. The sea rose, slowly, steadily, swallowing land that had been walked for generations. Entire hunting grounds disappeared. Sacred sites drowned. What happens to memory when the place it lived is now beneath the waves? And in response, humans moved, not just to chase prey, but to survive the water. Inland, uphill, into the heart of new landscapes, and those landscapes were not always generous. Where ice once ruled, new ecosystems were taking hold. Forests, thick and dark, replaced the open steppe. Grasslands spread across Europe and Asia. Animals that once roamed in abundance grew scarce, scattered. In some places, new species appeared, but smaller, swifter, harder to catch. In others, food became unpredictable, even in times of warmth. And in this shifting web of life, human knowledge, so perfectly tuned to the old world, suddenly felt uncertain. What must it have been like to wake up in the same valley you'd known for generations, and find it changed beyond recognition? And it was not just the world outside that changed. The change seeped into the human body, into the human memory, into the human myth. The bones we find from this time begin to tell a new story, not of giants, but of endurance, not of infinite migration, but of compromise. We begin to see evidence of longer stays, of more frequent returns to favoured places. The Earth's instability pushed us to seek stability, and in seeking it, we began to ask again what we might grow, what we might shape, what we might store. Was the disappearance of certainty the true mother of invention? In the far north, where glaciers still clung to stone, mammoths held on longer. But even there they faded. In warmer climates, the giants were already ghosts. Gone were the Irish elk with their massive antlers, their silhouettes once stretching across the horizon. Gone, too, were the woolly rhinoceroses, the cave lions, the dire wolves. Their bones lie beneath layers of silt and ash, quiet testimonies to a vanished age. Did humans hunt them into oblivion? Did the climate extinguish them? Or was it both? An entanglement of fire, hunger, and warming air that none could escape. And as the giants vanished, the pressure grew. Pressure on the landscape, on the herds that remained, and on the people who had always relied on them. In some places, populations grew, more mouths chasing fewer resources. In others, they declined, unable to adapt to the shifting balance. What do you do when the old gods of the hunt no longer answer your call? You adapt, or you die. And humans, ever adaptive, began to look smaller, not in stature, but in focus. Rabbits, birds, fish, roots. These had always been part of the diet, but now they became more central. The spears grew lighter, the traps more intricate, the time spent gathering increased, and slowly, without proclamation, the idea of abundance changed. No longer was it measured in mammoth bones, but in baskets of grain, in drying racks of fish, in caches of tubers hidden from the heat. Does survival come from strength or from flexibility? We see this shift in the tools. Microliths, tiny sharp stone flakes, replaced the massive spear points of earlier times. These were parts of complex hunting systems: arrows, barbs, harpoons. They reflect a world where the target is no longer a behemoth but a bird mid-flight, a trout in a stream, a deer that comes close only for moments, and with each kill, the margin for error narrows. Precision becomes everything. What kind of mind thrives when success means noticing the flick of a shadow in reeds? And in the quiet spaces between the hunt, humans noticed more. The rush of the chase had been replaced in part by the patience of observation. They watched how the grass grew different on the sunlit side of the hill. They listened to the calls of birds that nested only where the soil was soft. They noticed when mushrooms returned to the base of the same tree year after year, and in this noticing something deeper took root. What if understanding the land could be more powerful than pursuing what ran across it? The warming climate, for all its chaos, also brought beauty. Rain-fed valleys turned lush with life. Wild grains shimmered gold under longer summers. Trees flowered in ways that dazzled the senses, and in this beauty there was opportunity. The land offered new kinds of nourishment. Fruits that had once been bitter grew sweet in the changing sun. Insects once ignored became protein. Certain tree barks eased pain. But to access this bounty required stillness. It required listening. It required staying long enough to learn what grew and why. Does abundance change its meaning when it asks you to stop running? And yet, this new landscape had teeth. Floods came fast. Droughts came without warning. Animals migrated differently, or disappeared altogether. The earth was more alive now, but also more unpredictable. Some seasons were generous, others betrayed, and in this unpredictability humans began to seek new anchors, more reliable food, more controllable sources. The idea of waiting for game began to lose ground to the idea of growing what you need, not instead of hunting, but alongside it, a hedge against uncertainty, a gamble against starvation. How long must you be hungry before risk feels like wisdom? The warming world also brought people closer together. As some territories became more fertile, they drew more families. Camps that were once seasonal now overlapped. Resources that were once abundant became contested. And so we begin to see the outlines of social tension. Who gathers where? Who owns what? Can a grove belong to a family if they planted nothing there? Can a spring be claimed if it was found by someone else? These are the seeds of questions that would one day define civilizations. But here, in this early dawn of permanence, they were still new, still raw, and yet already inevitable. As humans drew closer to each other, they also drew closer to the land. Not as a canvas for the hunt, but as a partner in the slow choreography of survival. They began to manage stands of wild wheat. They cleared back invasive plants to favour useful ones. They returned to certain plots to harvest from the same bushes. Was this farming? Not yet. But it was something more than gathering. It was shaping. It was remembering. It was participating in the cycles of growth. And growth, like fire, is not easily contained. It spreads, not just across landscapes, but across generations. A child raised in a world where seeds are gathered and remembered does not see the wild in the same way as a child raised in the world of the mammoth hunt. The definition of what it means to live, to eat, to wait, begins to shift. Knowledge of ripening seasons becomes more valuable than strength alone. The best hunter is no longer the fastest, but the most patient. Is it possible that culture evolves not through invention, but through attention? In the Levant, we begin to see these changes crystallize in the archaeological record. The Natufians, a culture of semi-sedentary foragers, left behind homes with stone foundations, pestles worn smooth by years of grinding, cemeteries where the dead were placed with care and ritual, dogs, possibly the first animals truly domesticated, buried alongside humans. This was not civilization as we know it, but it was no longer wild roaming either. It was the first sketch of a new way to live, a way that held the memory of the chase and the promise of the harvest. But with this promise came pressure. More people meant more mouths, and more mouths meant more pressure on the land. Forests were cleared, soil was disturbed, rivers were redirected, if only slightly. And though the scale was still small, the trajectory was clear. To stay meant to shape meant to alter, and alteration, even when gentle, carries consequences. What happens when your survival depends not just on the Earth's generosity, but on its obedience? Obedience, of course, is never guaranteed. And so the early experimenters learned caution. A stand of wheat one year might fail the next. A spring might dry up. A grove of lentils might be choked out by weeds. Each failure carved lessons into the collective mind. rotate your gathering spots, store more than you need, diversify what you eat. Resilience became a new kind of strength, and perhaps in this need for stability, the first whispers of domestication began, not of plants alone, but of the self. To farm, one must resist impulse, one must think ahead, one must accept that work done today will not feed you tomorrow, but might save your children. And this vision of continuity, of time stretched beyond the individual, was a radical one. It required a shift in imagination. From the hunt, which ends in the moment of the kill, to the field, which begins with absence and ends in plenty if all goes well. How do you convince a people of the value of invisible futures? You don't. The land does. One sprout at a time, that was how the world began to convince us, not with a roar, not with a revelation, but with a gentle and persistent unfolding. The Holocene did not force humanity into agriculture. It invited us. Through shifting climates, through vanishing giants, through the rising tide and the retreating ice, it created new challenges, yes, but also new options. And in those options, humans found themselves changed. Not suddenly, but deeply. The old world of mammoths and endless migration had ended, and though the new world was not yet stable, it held a strange new potential. We began to dream differently. In the quiet of floodplains, in the shade of fig trees, in the smell of drying grain. We began to measure time in seasons, not just in steps. We began to see the land not only as something to cross, but as something to return to, something that remembered us. And as the earth settled into its warmer rhythm, so too did we. We built homes with deeper foundations. We left marks, pits, ditches, post holes, carved into the land itself. Marks that said, we were here, and we may return. But return required responsibility. If the land was to remember us, we had to remember it. Which patches had been over-harvested, which paths had become too worn, which groves bore fruit only every few years. Memory became a form of survival, and in memory we became more than wanderers. We became caretakers, not yet farmers, but something on the cusp, balance between movement and stillness, between the past and something just ahead. And that something was farming, not as a technology, not as a moment, but as a relationship, a negotiation. A long conversation between human desire and the earth's willingness. And like all relationships, it began with instability, with imbalance, with hope pressed against fear. But slowly, season by season, that conversation deepened. We asked more of the land, and the land sometimes answered. What happens when the world itself changes its terms? When abundance is not found, but made? When survival is no longer a chase, but a collaboration? That is when the hunger becomes a choice, and the future, for the first time, becomes ours to shape. But before the furrow, before the fence, before the permanent boundary etched between ours and not ours, there was water. Flowing, glittering, murmuring through stone and valley, it called to the early human mind not with possession, but with invitation. The rivers did not ask to be claimed. They offered presence, return, rhythm. And along their banks, in the gentle arms of lakes and springs, humanity did something quietly radical. It stayed. This is the true birth of the village, not the rise of kings or monuments or scripts, but the simple, collective act of pausing, of choosing a place to return to not just seasonally, but meaningfully. And in the Levant, around 12,000 years ago, one culture stepped into that pause and built something entirely new, the Natufians. Their legacy lies scattered across the rocky uplands and shadowed valleys, not in palaces but in stone circles pressed into earth, in sickle blades worn smooth with use, in cemeteries nestled beneath homes. They were not farmers yet, but they were no longer nomads. They built homes, round, sunken into the soil, reinforced with stone, covered perhaps in brush or hide. These were not fleeting shelters. They bore weight. They held heat. They held a memory. And in the bones found within them, of people and dogs, buried with care, we find echoes of permanence. What happens to the human spirit when home becomes more than a fire pit in the open air? These settlements were never large. Perhaps 20 people, maybe 30. clusters of families tied not just by blood but by shared labour, shared knowledge, shared hunger, and to feed that hunger, they wielded tools unlike any seen before. Microliths fixed into wooden handles, forming curved sickles, ideal for harvesting wild cereals. These tools speak to repetition, to cycles, to the gathering not of scattered chance, but of anticipated return. You do not build a sickle for luck, you build it for pattern. And with that pattern came structure. The Natufians ground grain on stones so heavy they must have remained in place for years. They baked in communal ovens, fired by shared wood. They created not through central command, but through mutual reliance. What must it have felt like to sit at a stone threshold, watching smoke curl into the morning air, knowing that for the first time you might still be here tomorrow? And in the stillness, risk began to take root, because to stay is to depend, and dependence, for all its comfort, makes you vulnerable. When humans lived on the move, failure could be outrun. If a grove failed, you left it. If a river ran dry, you found another. But once you stay, the success of the place becomes your success, and its failure your undoing. What if the grain does not ripen? What if the animals avoid this valley for a season? What if the water, once sweet, begins to sour? The moment we stop wondering, we must begin predicting, and prediction is a heavy burden. But prediction also births innovation. The early villages were sites of constant experimentation. Walls thickened, floors were plastered, storage pits were lined with clay or ash. People dug deeper into the earth to stay warm in winter, built higher to stay dry in flood. They shaped their homes to echo the shape of the hills, and as their confidence in the landscape grew, so too did their expression. Carvings began to appear, not just functional, but aesthetic. Decorated tools, beads of shell and bone. What does beauty mean when it's made to last? Cemeteries also emerged, not far from the homes but often beneath them. The dead were not sent away. They remained, buried under floors, tucked into house corners, revisited through memory and ritual. Skulls were sometimes removed, plastered, painted. Ancestors were not gone. They were present, watching, guiding, perhaps even binding the living to the place through more than just utility. Can memory be anchored in soil? And so we see in these sites the slow knitting together of community, not by force, but by presence. You eat beside those you bury. You sleep above those you remember. You work beside those whose tools you once inherited. The walls become thicker, but not just in structure, in meaning, in history. Every stone, every doorway, every tool passed hand to hand becomes part of a living archive, a place where time deepens rather than simply passes, and as time deepens, so does reliance. The grinding stones wear down to their final layers. The fields around the village show signs of regular harvesting. Game becomes harder to find near camp. The people have reshaped the land, and the land in turn begins to reshape them. What does it do to a mind, to a body, to a society, when survival depends not on the next step forward, but on what grows in place? This is where place begins to bind, not just physically, but psychologically, symbolically, spiritually. The land ceases to be backdrop. It becomes character. A force to be interpreted, negotiated with, depended on. A slope is no longer just a feature. It is the barley slope, the place where the roots take hold early. The flat near the spring is the lentil ground. The grove above the river holds the beehives, the shade, the herbs. Every stone becomes known. Every tree is counted. You do not walk blindly through this world. You walk through memory, through inheritance, through story. And stories now begin to settle. Oral traditions, once fluid and travelling with the group, now tether themselves to place. A tale of a hunt becomes a tale of this field. A myth of the moon becomes linked to the hill where the elder was buried. The cycles of the sky map themselves onto the crops. Time becomes local. Meaning becomes geographic. What happens to myth when it is grounded? With this grounding comes complexity. Shared labour becomes necessary, but so too does negotiation. Who gets the best plot near the spring? Who guards the grain store through the winter? How are disputes resolved when neighbours no longer walk away but sleep 10 feet apart? The earliest villages may not have had rulers, but they had decisions. They had customs, they had consequences, and in these we see the quiet birth of structure, not imposed, but emergent. And from structure grows specialization. Some grind better than others, some shape blades, some tend the ovens, some remember the sky. This is not hierarchy, but interdependence. And that interdependence allows for something unprecedented, surplus. When there is more grain than can be eaten in a day, it can be stored. When there is stored grain, there is time. When there is time, there is imagination. And with imagination comes art. The first decorations in these homes are humble, incised lines, simple beads, patterns pressed into wet clay. But they speak of humans beginning to express something beyond survival. And beyond survival, they begin to dream. But dreaming in place is not without cost. To tie oneself to land is to tie oneself to its fate. Floods now bring not just inconvenience, but destruction. A poor harvest is not a passing trouble, it is starvation. You cannot outrun the failing field. You cannot walk away from a village half built. And so security becomes paradox. The more you build, the more you have to lose. What happens when stability becomes its own form of risk? And yet, they stayed. Not because it was safer, not because it was easier, but because something had shifted. The logic of movement had been replaced by the logic of return. There was now an expectation in the soil, a rhythm in the stone. The earth had become a partner, and partnership requires presence. So they endured the risks, they rebuilt, they reaped what they could. And in the patterns of these settlements, we see the first true signs of attachment, not to tribe or to season, but to place. In the debris of ancient homes we find seeds charred by accident, broken blades worn from too many harvests, small figures, perhaps deities, perhaps memories. We find animal bones arranged with care, suggesting feasts or rituals. We find footprints pressed into ancient floors, the ghosts of those who stayed. What must it feel like to walk the same path your great-grandmother once did? Not across a migration route, but through a doorway made of stone. With this continuity comes innovation. Clay begins to shape not just storage, but cooking. New tools emerge for grinding, mixing, baking. The kitchen is no longer a fire in the open air. It is part of the home, part of the ritual, and food, once hunted and shared on the move, becomes an act of craft. Preparation, patience. You do not simply eat, you cook, you gather together, and in the act of eating you affirm not just life, but culture. Culture now becomes embodied in layout, in architecture, in the decision to align homes a certain way, or build ovens in communal spaces, in the choice to bury the dead with beads or blades. Every choice becomes echo. Every echo becomes foundation. And that foundation begins to outlive individuals. Children are born into these villages not as wanderers, but as inheritors. They do not ask where to go next. They ask how to stay. But staying also reshapes the body. We begin to see changes in skeletons, joints worn from grinding, teeth ground down by grit in stone-ground flour. We see new diseases, crowding, proximity, parasites, and still they stayed. Because the alternative, uncertainty, hunger, the chase, was no longer the measure of success. Success now meant full granaries, quiet winters, a known path from home to spring. And in that known path, something unexpected was growing. Identity. What does it mean to be from somewhere? This question, still so central today, was born here, in the muddy threshold of a Natufian home, in the stretch of land where someone first whispered, "This is ours," not as conquest, not as empire, but as belonging. And belonging, once kindled, becomes an ember no storm can snuff out. When you belong, you endure, through bad seasons, through flood, through loss. Because the land is no longer just what feeds you, it is what defines you. And in that definition, humans changed, not biologically, not immediately, but psychically, spiritually. To be from a place is to see its contours in your dreams. To measure your life not in miles walked, but in seasons returned. The earth had always been sacred, but now it was sacred because it knew you back. We find in these early villages the echoes of permanence not yet perfected. Homes were abandoned, rebuilt, sometimes burned. People still moved, but differently. No longer as hunters chasing prey, but as neighbours seeking better soil. As families returning to the same valley after a failed harvest. As people navigating the tension between where they came from and where they hoped to root. This is the threshold. Not quite nomadic, not quite settled, but woven with both. And in this weaving, the seeds of true agriculture began to stir. They were not yet planted in straight rows, but they were planted in thought, in planning, in rhythm. You cannot grind grain without first expecting its return. You cannot build a village oven without expecting people to gather, and you cannot bury your dead beneath your home unless you believe, somehow, that you will still be here. The Natufians left no written word, no lasting monuments, and yet their trace lingers, in the curve of a stone wall, in a burial wrapped in flowers, in the way they looked at a landscape and saw not terrain, but potential. They lived on the edge of the world we now inhabit, the world of home, of harvest, of staying. And through their choices we begin to see the first outlines of the price we pay for permanence, and the rewards we seek from it. Because in the end, to stay is to believe that a patch of earth can hold not just food, but meaning. That water returning each spring can be more than just a cycle, it can be a promise. That roots once planted hold fast even through storms. That place, once chosen, begins to choose us back. And what happens when the land chooses us? We begin to build not just for today, but for all the tomorrows we hope will come. A human presses a seed into the soil, not with ceremony, not with certainty, but with a quiet, trembling hope. This is not yet agriculture. It is not yet a revolution. It is a question. A seed vanishes into the earth, and the world waits. Will it rise? Will it feed? Will it answer us? Long before this moment, before grain stores and furrowed fields, humans lived by the rhythms of movement, by paths shaped not by roads but by instinct and memory. But in scattered corners of the world, in river valleys and dry plateaus, something subtle was changing. It didn't look like fire or invention. It looked like hesitation. It looked like staying. And staying brought observation. Among the stony outcrops and cool shadows of the Near East and far beyond, in the Zagros, the Levant, the Taurus foothills, small groups began to notice things they had once only passed by. That the wild barley here returned each spring, that lentils clustered thick in these valleys, that the grasses growing beneath their feet were not just passive. They followed rules. They repeated themselves. They held memory in their stalks. What happens when you stop walking long enough to see the same plant twice? It is easy to imagine. A woman gathering seed heads in late summer watches the wind scatter a few onto disturbed soil. She moves on. She returns months later, green shoots, unbidden, where there were none before. Perhaps she smiles. Perhaps she wonders. Perhaps she marks the place in her memory, or with a stone. And with this, the first experiment begins. Not in a lab, not in a temple, but in the soil beneath our feet, silent, invisible, slow. These earliest moments of cultivation were almost certainly accidental. Wherever humans camped and tossed the chaff of their harvest, plants responded. They followed us. They grew around us. We shaped the land with our waste and our wakefulness. But the land shaped us in return. The camps where families returned year after year became zones of botanical disturbance, rich in trampled earth and ash, layered in discarded seeds and human waste. In these altered micro-environments, certain plants began to thrive, not because they were better in the wild, but because they were better near us. Their seeds clung to clothing, their grains stayed on the stalk longer, they matured faster, or all at once, and humans noticed. How could they not? When the first green blades of grain returned unbidden, not in the wild hills, but at the very edges of the hearth, what thoughts did they inspire? Was it coincidence, gift, invitation, or responsibility? What happens when the earth responds to your footsteps? Not all seeds would grow, not all harvests would return. But slowly, subtly, humans began to interfere. A little weeding, a little clearing, a little more patience between the sowing and the journey. And just like that, the thread was pulled, and 1,000-year unravelling began. And just like that, the thread was pulled, and 1,000-year unravelling began. Because with that unravelling came decision, not once, but every season. Would you gather the wild wheat on the hill, or wait for the plants you scattered near camp to mature? Would you pass through the landscape as before, or would you linger just a few days more to watch over the shoots now breaking the surface? How do you walk away from something you've begun to shape? Those early plants, incorn, emmer, chickpeas, were never domesticated all at once. Their relationship with humans was like a slow courtship, full of uncertainty and experiment. If some plants grew better when weeded, we weeded. If others responded to watering from a cracked gourd, we watered. If a fence of thorns kept the gazelle away, we built one again. These were not yet farmers. But they were no longer just foragers either, and this was not a matter of convenience. It was a wager against hunger, to delay a hunt, to remain in one place through a frost or a dry spell, to risk energy on a crop that might fail. These were not small choices. They were profound acts of trust in a world that had never promised permanence. The seed was not just a potential meal, it was a prayer. And what happens when a prayer grows roots? The archaeological record is whisper-thin here. Scattered impressions of sickle blades worn smooth from gathering, charred grains buried deep in hearth ash, even pollen in layers of soil that hints at plants growing where wild grass had not. These are not monuments, they are ghosts, but their presence is enough. Enough to suggest that people were beginning to see the land not just as something to move through, but something to shape, and to be shaped by. Because when people plant seeds, they do more than alter the land, they alter themselves. The rhythm of days begins to shift, no longer governed solely by game migration or weather patterns, but by the heartbeat of the growing season. Tasks appear that did not exist before: guarding, tending, waiting. The elders might still remember the wide-roaming days of pure foraging, but their children would be born into new expectations, a place, a cycle, a memory of continuity that had never truly existed before. And with the hope of continuity came the fear of its loss. What if the rain doesn't come? What if the crop withers? What if the granary, if it can be called that, runs empty in the dead of winter? Suddenly life is not only shaped by nature's abundance but by its failure. Security and fragility grow side by side. The more we count on the harvest, the more devastating its absence. The earth is no longer a backdrop. It is a partner, a parent, a risk. And yet, the seed keeps calling. Because what the seed offers is not just food, but transformation, a way of life that remembers the past yet roots itself in the future. You don't plant for today, you plant for a tomorrow that may never come, and to believe in that tomorrow, you must imagine it. The act of planting, then, becomes an act of imagination, and perhaps nothing human is more sacred than that. But this vision, of sowing and reaping, of shaping nature, was not without its toll. Stored grain, once gathered, became a different kind of possession. It could be counted, guarded, taken. The seed that once fed the village now marked a boundary, of ownership, of hunger, of control. Who decided where the grain would be kept? Who ensured it was safe? What hand reached for more than it had sown? A new kind of power began to bud in the shadows of the granary. It wasn't yet a king or a priest or a merchant, but it was the quiet authority of those who remembered which seeds had grown and where. Those who knew when to harvest, when to wait, when to risk the stored surplus for another season's gamble. And even in its earliest whispers, this shift was immense. Because with stored food came the ability to survive winter, but also to shape who did and who didn't. Suddenly, food was no longer just something earned in the wild, but something distributed. And from distribution, the seeds of inequality began to sprout. But there was more than food at stake. Stored seeds were more than calories. They were potential. In small pits lined with ash or buried in baskets woven from grass, early peoples protected their future. If a harvest failed, those hidden reserves might be life itself. If they survived mold, moisture, theft, they could offer continuity, a second chance. What kind of trust does it take to bury your survival beneath the soil and walk away, hoping it will be there when you return? This new relationship with food was fragile and full of tension. Because to depend on grain was to depend on time, on patience, on memory, on labour spread across months. A hunt is over in a day, a field takes a year. But slowly, again and again, humans chose the year. And every time they returned to a clearing found their seeds still waiting, green and rising. That choice grew stronger. One day, perhaps, it no longer felt like a choice at all. Perhaps it felt like fate. Was it? Was this truly our invention, or had the seed all along been cultivating us? Because with each season, the plants we favoured began to change, and we changed with them. Those first grains that clung too tightly to the stalk were once an annoyance to the forager, hard to thresh, reluctant to fall. But now, in the growing patches shaped by human hands, that same trait became a virtue. These plants dropped fewer seeds to the wind. They were easier to gather, more survived. So they spread, not in the wild, but in our company. And with them spread our dependence. As seasons passed, the wheat in the Near East grew taller and more obedient. The barley bent less in the wind. The lentils flowered in tighter clusters. In every camp where seeds were sown and gathered, not just consumed, humans began shaping evolution without knowing its name. But it wasn't one-sided. The landscape began to bend under our presence. Where once only tough wild grass grew, new soils appeared, churned by digging, darkened by ash, enriched by human waste. Micro-ecosystems flourished in our wake. Mice and birds followed our grain. We followed the rhythm of sowing and harvest. Even our tools changed. The flint blades once used to butcher game found new edges, serrated, curved for slicing stalks instead of sinew. Grinding stones appeared, worn smooth by the endless repetition of turning grain into meal. The act of eating now required preparation. Bread was born, not as the crusted loaf of ovens, but as paste, as porridge, as scorched cakes over stone. With every innovation, new tasks emerged. New roles, new dependencies. What once was a shared, ever-moving labour of gathering became a tethered rhythm of tending. Children helped chase off birds. Elders remembered planting cycles. Hands learned to sort seeds, keeping the best, discarding the damaged. And when the rains came late, as they sometimes did, all of it trembled. To live by the seed was to live by time, and time was never kind. Floods drowned the hopes of spring. Frosts claimed the first shoots. Pests arrived in swarms, and still we planted. Because to return to the old way, to wander, to forage, to trust the uncertain generosity of the wild, felt further and further away. Was it nostalgia? Was it regret? Or simply the realization that each step forward came with its own shadows? Every harvest that filled a clay jar came with the memory of a failed season. Every field that flourished was a quiet reminder of what could be lost. But the work continued. The seed waited, and humans, bound now not just to each other, but to the land beneath them, kept pressing it into the earth. Because hope, once planted, is hard to uproot. They gathered together to clear stones, to shape terraces, to dig furrows, not as ceremony, but as necessity. And in that shared necessity a new kind of community was born, one not defined by blood or lineage, but by labour, by waiting, by trust. And with each generation the skills deepened, when to plant, how to store, where the soil held moisture, how to spot the sickness of leaves. This was no longer memory, it was knowledge, and knowledge was power. From this quiet power rose the first divisions, not cruel, not yet, but real. Who knew how to read the land? Who had the patience to tend? Who had the time to watch the sprouts each day while others hunted or carved or carried water? Dependency bred structure. Structure bred imbalance. But even as new burdens emerged, so did new beauty. The landscape, once indifferent, began to carry the signature of human hands. The golden shimmer of barley under a summer wind, the orderly rows of sprouting emmer along a riverbank, the scent of charred chaff after a harvest fire. The world was no longer just a canvas. It was a collaboration. And in this collaboration we changed. Bones grew denser, teeth wore down in new patterns, jaws narrowed, faces softened, not by will, but by diet, by time, by labour. Even our genes shifted subtly, shaped by a world in which grain was now king. But not just grain. The experiment had begun with one kind of seed, but its roots spread wide. What else could grow? What other plants might yield to this magic? Peas, flax, sesame. Each offered its own lesson. Each required its own patience. The field was no longer a place. It was a world of questions, and behind every question, hunger, not just for food, but for something more, stability, meaning, belonging. How do you know if an experiment has succeeded? Is it in the harvest, or in the fact that we still return season after season to press our hopes into soil? Maybe that is the answer, not in the yield, but in the returning. Because even now, in the bones of our cities and the grids of our farms, we carry the shape of that first question, that first seed, that first waiting silence, and whether we name it trust or risk or need, the result is the same. We changed the world, and in doing so, we changed ourselves. The plough was not born of leisure, nor the grindstone forged in joy. The earliest farmers did not plant because they wanted to, but because they had to. It is one of the oldest misunderstandings of our species that farming was a clever convenience, a sudden spark of brilliance that made life easier. But the truth is quieter, harder, and more enduring. Farming spread not because it was simple, but because it was necessary. Not a triumph of intelligence alone, but of desperation, exhaustion, and hope. Once the seeds were planted, there was no turning back. Picture the bodies of these first sowers, shoulders rounded not by age but by repetition, wrists worn smooth from pounding grains against stone, vertebrae compressed under the weight of baskets filled not with food, but with the promise of food. They had stepped into a contract with the land. If you stay, it will feed you, but only if you feed it first. And so began a rhythm unlike anything before. Not the wild unpredictability of hunting, nor the adaptable wandering of foraging, but a calendar carved into the body. Dig, plant, wait, weed, protect, pray. Why did they keep going? Why did this punishing cycle spread? Because for every back it broke, it fed two mouths. Because the fields could be counted on in a way the herds and the forests could not. Because the world was changing, again, and in a warming, drying, crowded landscape. Mobility was no longer salvation. It was risk. And so, slowly, painstakingly, farming took root, not as an invention, but as a submission, not as liberation, but as burden. What does it mean to build your life around a plant? Grain does not chase, it does not flee or fight, it waits, it withers, it thrives in stillness. To grow it well is to become like it, stilled, settled, anchored. The sickle replaced the spear, the hoe, the hand axe. Crops demanded planning, protection, vigilance, and the earth, once wild and indifferent, now had expectations. You owed it something. You had to clear it of rocks. You had to fence it from animals. You had to feed it water, guard it from wind, remove the competition. This is labour not of adventure, but of permanence, and permanence had a price. The first fields were not just spaces of opportunity, they were thresholds of vulnerability. Pests came, weeds came, disease came, not just to the plants, but to the people. Rats followed the granaries, mosquitoes bred in irrigation channels, standing water festered, and as bodies huddled together in settlements to protect their crops, the pathogens they carried learned to leap. Skin touched skin, breath mingled with breath, and sickness spread in a way it never had in the open drifting life before. What happens when a body is fed but not nourished? What happens when your labour multiplies your risk? What happens when the grain owns you? You begin to change, not just your days, but your bones, your blood, your teeth. The human body, once shaped by the chase, by balance and variety, by movement across open ground and forest shade, now stiffened into stillness, bent into repetition. For 100,000 years we'd eaten from a wide seasonal palette, nuts and berries, roots and tubers, fish pulled fresh from rivers, meat cut from the flank of beasts whose names we no longer even know. And now we ate grain. Grain in the morning, grain at night, sometimes pounded into porridge, sometimes baked into flatbread, sometimes soaked and soured or cracked and boiled, but always grain, barley, emmer, einkorn. The names change depending on where you are, in Mesopotamia, in the Nile Valley, in the foothills of Anatolia, but the effect is the same. The menu narrows, the body protests, protein becomes rare, teeth begin to rot. The grinding stones used to make flour also grind bits of stone into that flour, wearing enamel away. Exposing nerves. Jawbones unearthed from early farming sites show abscesses, infections, decay. Skeletons shrink, lifespans shorten. Children die younger, but there is more of them. Because what farming takes in vitality, it gives back in numbers. A single plot of land can feed more mouths with wheat than with game, and so population grows, slowly at first, then exponentially. The human swarm begins not in the age of stone spears, but in the age of harvested grain, and every new mouth is a promise that the field must not fail, that the labour must continue, that the burden must be borne, and it grows heavier. The sowing is one part. But there is also the reaping, the threshing, the winnowing, the storing, the guarding. You no longer move with the season, you move with the harvest. You no longer sleep when you're tired, but when the tasks allow. The day bends around the field, the village around the granary, the society around the harvest. This is not to say it was all misery. That would be another myth. There were festivals, there were full bellies in good years, there were children who grew up never knowing hunger. There were first loves beside irrigation ditches and laughter rising from clay ovens at dusk. Farming brought its own kind of stability. But it was a stability paid in full, each year with sweat and submission. The grain does not let you rest for long. And behind all of this, quietly, invisibly, disease waits. Once, in small foraging bands, illness might strike one or two. Now, in clustered homes and shared air, it strikes dozens. Waste accumulates, vermin multiply, water sources are fouled, new illnesses, born of proximity and permanence, rise up: cholera, dysentery, tuberculosis. We do not yet know their names, but our bodies begin to carry them. The body weakens, but the numbers grow, and that changes everything. Because when numbers grow, so do needs. Needs for land, needs for storage, needs for tools, needs for rules. In the hunter's world, authority was fluid, shifting with circumstance. Who was best at reading tracks, or calming conflict, or finding water? In the farmer's world, it becomes rooted. A harvest cannot be negotiated, it must be protected, rationed, owned, and so ownership is born. A field belongs to a family, a granary belongs to a village. Boundaries are drawn not on sand but on soil, marked with stone, watched over with vigilance. The seed becomes a source of conflict, of inheritance, of debt, not just a gift from the land, but a lever of power. This is where we begin to see hierarchy. Some tend the fields, others store the yield. Some begin to command, to count, to plan. Tasks divide, roles harden, gender divides widen. Those who labour most do not always eat best, and those who guard the stores do not always gather them. A quiet tension builds in the village, and yet life persists. The oven is still warm at dusk. The fire still dances behind shared meals. These early communities are not broken, but they are shifting. The rhythms of mobility, of flexible sharing and mutual dependence have been replaced with stillness, specialization, and inequality. Slowly, quietly, the seeds of class are planted alongside the barley. And through it all, the work continues. Ploughing becomes heavier. Early tools, once made of sharpened wood and chipped stone, give way to polished flint. Later to copper. Oxen, when domesticated, change everything. The yoke turns muscle into force, and a single farmer can now drag a plough across far more land. But that power, like all power, requires its own burden. The ox must be fed, housed, protected, cared for. You now farm not just for your family but for your tools. It is an arms race with the land. As fields expand, so do pests. Aphids, beetles, fungi. They come in silence, and they come in swarms. And because your life now depends on this narrow margin of success, 1 or 2 staple crops, you cannot afford to lose even a small portion. The early farmers become vigilant, paranoid, watching the skies, measuring rainfall, checking leaves for spots, reading the wind, because 1 failed harvest means hunger, 2 failed harvests mean collapse, and always the grain watches silently. It has bound the people to it. It has shaped their tools, their bodies, their towns. It has spread across valleys and hillsides, following human footsteps as surely as those humans follow its growth. It is both master and sustenance, both prison and promise. And still, the people do not stop. They can't. The fields have become their future, and in that future, something else begins to grow. Something invisible at first, but deeply human. Anxiety. When food is gathered fresh each day, failure is brief, and tomorrow may bring a better hunt. But when food is grown in seasons and harvested once a year, failure is total. A single bad harvest doesn't mean hunger for a night. It means starvation for a winter. The early farmers live with this looming shadow. Every cloud is watched. Every pest is a threat. Every rumour of rot or frost spreads through the village like fire. Fear becomes a season of its own, and so people begin to hedge. They dig deeper storage pits. They burn out the fungus from their granaries. They invent baskets sealed with pitch, jars that can be corked, underground chambers cooled by shade. And still, it's not enough. Because even stored grain decays. Even stored grain draws thieves, both human and animal. So new tasks emerge: guarding, counting, rationing, and along with them, punishment. For the first time in the archaeological record, we begin to see formalised walls, not just for protection from wild animals, but from each other. Villages that once shared begin to divide. A family with 2 jars guards them from a neighbour with none. The presence of stored wealth, visible, tangible, hoardable, creates temptation. And soon after, retribution. Grain brings abundance, but it also brings crime, and not just theft, but war. Because if your land is no longer just your home, but your lifeline, what happens when someone else wants it? We see the first evidence of conflict between settled communities: burnt houses, broken walls, skulls cracked not by accident but by intent. And while we should never reduce early farming to endless violence, there is no doubt that competition over fields, over harvests, over water, begins to leave a mark on the landscape and on the bones buried beneath it. And so, agriculture reshapes not just the soil, but the soul. It teaches caution, it rewards suspicion, it demands discipline, and perhaps most tragically it narrows the human gaze. Once, we looked across the whole horizon, scanning for signs of game, for cloud movement, for the colour of fruit in the canopy. Now we look down into the rows of sprouting grain, into the cracks of dry earth, into the clay of irrigation channels. The world becomes smaller, more knowable, more controllable, and also more fragile. For all its burdens, for all its cost, farming becomes a kind of faith, a belief that the land will provide, if only we do everything right, if only we obey its timing, its needs, its silences. And in that belief, humans begin to shape rituals, offerings, songs to the harvest, prayers to the rain, not as superstition, but as structure, as a way to make sense of the immense responsibility they have taken on. Because once you rely on a seed, you rely on the sky, and the sky does not answer, at least not always. Sometimes the rains come late, sometimes they come too hard. Sometimes the frost arrives early, or the sun wilts young shoots before they've taken root. And so the farmer waits, not just with effort, but with fear and hope. The most fragile hope there is, that things will go according to plan. Because this is the paradox of farming. You trade freedom for certainty, but the certainty is never certain. And yet, still, the work continues. Because even with the aching backs, even with the hollow calories, even with the disease and the social strain and the risk of failure, farming feeds more. It creates more life. It multiplies the number of human beings who can exist in a given space. And more humans means more hands, more ideas, more conflict, more change. It means villages become towns, towns become cities, cities become civilizations, and it all begins with the seed. But what a cost! The bones of the early farmers tell this story without words. Stunted growth, spinal compression, broken toes from dropped grinding stones, arthritic knees from squatting in fields, cracked molars, perforated sinuses from grain dust. Their lives were not short because they were primitive. They were short because they worked too hard, because they placed their trust in the earth, and the earth did not always return the favour. Still, we must not imagine them as tragic. These were not people crushed under progress. They were people who made choices, brave ones, difficult ones. They knew the work, they knew the risk. But they believed that this new way of life, this settled, seasonal, sacrificial rhythm was worth it. That it offered something the old ways could not. A future. Not just for themselves, but for their children. And their children's children. And in this, perhaps, we see the quiet beginning of civilization. Not in temples or kings or writing, but in a woman planting grain not for herself, but for someone she will never meet. In a man digging a trench not for glory, but so the roots of next year's crop will find water. In a child learning the names of plants they may one day eat, if the rains are kind. This is the burden of grain. It is not simply food, it is obligation, a pact, a promise. It is the moment when humanity begins to live not just in the present, but in the imagined future. And it is the moment when that future begins to shape us in return. So when we speak of farming, as a triumph, as a revolution, we must also speak of the toll, the burden, the bones beneath the fields, the hands that bled into the soil, the backs that bent and never unbent again. And we must understand. It was not easier, it was not kinder, but it was, for better or worse, ours. It begins not with conquest, but with proximity. Long before there were shepherds, there were shadows. At the edges of human firelight, eyes gleamed, goats watching from the cliffs, pigs rooting in discarded middens, wild sheep slipping between the hills like ghosts. They were not enemies, not anymore. They were tolerated, then welcomed, then shaped. And in this moment, a moment stretched across thousands of years, something ancient shifted. The hunted became the companion. The chasm between wild and domestic, between freedom and control, began to narrow, not with force, but with patience. What makes a creature give up the open plain for a fence? Perhaps it is hunger. The promise of scraps, a wounded foot healed with care, a lamb saved from the jaws of a predator. Perhaps it is a kind of truce, an unspoken agreement between species, or perhaps, even deeper, it is loneliness, a recognition between eyes of two kinds who live in groups, who protect their young, who remember kindness and hold grudges, who mourn and yearn and watch the horizon. What happens when such creatures meet in the same valley? From the mountains of the Zagros to the foothills of Anatolia, this quiet revolution took shape. Goats first, then sheep. Not seized, but enticed. Not bred in cages, but followed. Some were gentler than others. Some stayed close, even when they could run. And over time, those were the ones who survived. Slowly, silently, generation after generation, animals that had once bounded free became those that lingered behind, those that listened. This was domestication, but not as control. It was a conversation. The bones tell the tale. In the earliest herding sites, the marks of human influence are faint. The animals are still wild, their bodies nearly indistinguishable from their untamed kin. But then the signatures begin. Changes in horn shape, changes in size, a skew in the age of bones, suggesting culling strategies. And most poignantly, they appear not in isolation, but in clusters, alongside tools and dwellings and fire pits, buried beneath villages that hummed with new purpose. What must it have felt like for the first human child to grow up with a goat not as prey, but as playmate? To watch a mother sheep give birth and know that its milk would not just nourish its lamb, but the people too? To see a pig waddle through a courtyard and not prepare a spear, but a feeding trough? We do not know their names. We do not know their rituals, but we can imagine the awe, the intimacy, the unfolding question, could life be shared, not just taken? What are the boundaries between survival and stewardship, and how do they change the soul of the one who dares to cross them? To become a shepherd is not merely to possess animals, it is to watch over them. It is to wake before dawn and sleep only after the last bleat has faded into the night. It is to walk beside another species every day, to learn its habits, to read its moods, and in doing so something ancient softens, the spear is lowered, the chase becomes care. But domestication is not love alone. It is milk, it is meat, it is manure, it is wool. Each animal, over time, offers something new, not just sustenance but utility. Goats give milk rich in fat, even in poor soils where grain will not grow. Sheep, through mutation and human favour, begin to grow denser coats. What was once hair becomes fleece, and with it, the need for new tools, spindles, looms, baskets to carry the raw fibre. Weaving becomes a quiet revolution of its own. Insulation, storage, clothing that can be layered, traded, dyed. Pigs are less mobile but efficient. They eat what humans discard, turning scraps into fat. Their flesh feeds many, and their bones suggest early efforts at corralling them near settlements. Cattle arrive later, stronger, more imposing, slower to domesticate. But with them comes true transformation, muscle that can pull, power that can plough. This is not yet machinery, but it is motion. With animals, the scale of farming expands. Land once too heavy to till with hand tools becomes reachable, and so the human web stretches wider. More food, more mouths, more villages, more paths to conflict and cooperation. These creatures are no longer just companions, they are partners in a growing system, a system as fragile as it is fruitful. But what is given can also be taken, because dependence runs in both directions. The animals need humans now. They cannot migrate freely. They cannot flee predators. Their bodies have changed, bones shorter, minds quieter, instincts dulled by care. And in return, humans too are changed. No longer mere foragers or gatherers, they become keepers, watchers, stewards and wardens of life that would not exist without them. And here, the ethical questions begin to surface. What do we owe a creature we have tamed? When does necessity become exploitation? There are no simple answers in the archaeological record. Only evidence of pens, of tools, of milk residues in ancient pots, of figurines shaped not just as deities, but as animals. Revered perhaps, loved perhaps, used certainly. The line between affection and utility blurs, and in that blurring, a new kind of emotional life emerges. The bond between human and animal is not just practical, it is profound. It shapes stories, songs, rituals. Children are named after animals. Myths imagine gods with hooves and horns. People dream of sheep in the night, and sometimes they grieve when they are gone. This is no longer a tale of survival. It is a story of entanglement. To live with animals is to invite them into the rhythms of daily life, not as fleeting shadows in the forest, but as presences, persistent, demanding, familiar. They wake when we wake. They need shelter when storms roll in. They give birth. They fall ill. And in their need, they tether us. The shepherd cannot wander far. The herder must always return. What began as a means of increasing food security now begins to define time itself. Seasons marked not just by harvest, but by lambing, by shearing, by calving. The calendar becomes an animal rhythm, and with it the soul of the village shifts. Life is no longer punctuated by the chase, by the adrenaline of the hunt. It is slower now, cyclical, built around repetition and care. A different kind of intelligence begins to flourish, one of observation, patience, memory. Children learn the shapes of hooves, the sound of distress, the curve of an udder heavy with milk. They do not need to be taught with words. They learn by watching, by imitating, by living alongside. This knowledge becomes embodied, held in hands, in feet, in gesture. And yet, there is also pain. because the animals they raise are still killed. There is no fantasy of a peaceful coexistence without death. Goats are still eaten, sheep are still slaughtered. The difference is not in the outcome, but in the relationship. Now, death carries a weight. The animal has a name, it has a place in the memory of the family. It has been fed by the same hands that now bring the knife. This is the quiet sorrow of domestication. It asks us to love what we must also let go. Some societies begin to shape rituals around this paradox: offerings, songs, ceremonial meals. The bones of sacrificed animals are placed with care beneath homes, or buried in designated pits. Not waste, but memory. Not disposal, but reverence. Perhaps this is the beginning of ethics, not in abstract rules, but in the embodied tension between care and consumption. And in this tension, something else is born. Dependency. For all that humans give animals, shelter, protection, food, it is nothing compared to what the animals now give back. Their milk nourishes infants when mothers cannot. Their dung fertilizes fields. Their strength pulls burdens no human could. Their hair becomes rope and warmth and cloth. A family with animals survives a bad season. A village with animals survives a drought. Animals are not just food, they are wealth, insurance, status. But that wealth is also fragile. Disease spreads easily in enclosed spaces. Animals must be watched for illness, isolated, treated, if the knowledge exists. A single outbreak can devastate a community, and where one group has animals and another does not, envy arises. Trade begins. Theft. War. A goat is no longer just a goat. It is a symbol of prosperity, of survival, of power. The wild heart has not only been tamed, it has been absorbed into the human world, and in doing so, it reshapes that world in return. Now, settlements are built with animals in mind: pens, stalls, grazing routes. Pathways widen to move herds through. Villages stretch along pastures and rivers not just for crops, but for watering livestock. Dogs, once wild themselves, are welcomed at the fringes to guard against wolves, to help guide and gather. They too are domesticated, not only for labour, but for companionship. The earliest burials of dogs alongside humans date back nearly 15,000 years, some curled beside their owners as if asleep. This intimacy with animals changes how humans see the land, not as something to be passed through, but as something to be maintained, watched, improved. Land is no longer simply occupied, it is managed. Grazing schedules are set, fallow fields are rotated, stone walls emerge to keep animals in and others out. The landscape becomes a mosaic of human intention, shaped not by brute force, but by the quiet repetition of care. But such care also tightens the bonds of responsibility. When animals fall ill, it is no longer the concern of a single family. Disease can spread across herds, across villages, and so, knowledge must spread too. Herbal treatments, isolation practices, observations passed from elder to youth. In this way, animal domestication becomes an engine for cultural memory. What works is remembered, what fails is mourned. Stories form around it all: the clever goat, the brave dog, the sacred cow. Myth and biology begin to braid together, and somewhere along the way the old instincts begin to fade. The chase becomes a story of the past. Spears are replaced with sticks, snares with fences. The children who once would have been trained as hunters now grow up watching for signs of hoof rot or teaching calves to follow a halter. Their courage is still needed, but it is quieter now. It lives in endurance, in vigilance, in the long, unglamorous work of care. This transformation is not total, not everywhere. In some places, hunting persists alongside herding. In others, domestication fails to take root. But in the Fertile Crescent, in the Levant, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, it spreads, because it works, because it feeds more mouths, because it survives winter, because it creates surpluses, and with surpluses come choices: trade, storage, protection. Animals become currency, herds become inheritance. And slowly, over centuries, the wild heart becomes something else. It becomes routine. This may be the greatest power of domestication. Not that it changes animals, but that it makes the extraordinary ordinary. What once took awe now becomes expectation. Milk in the morning, wool in the spring, manure to spread before planting. These are not miracles. They are Tuesday. They are the hum of life under a sky that no longer surprises but simply turns day after day. And yet, in the quiet of that repetition, the old reverence still lingers. The shepherd still sings to the flock, the child still names the lamb, the tether between species holds. Even now, in the stillness of ancient settlements turned to dust, we find traces of that bond, carved figures of cattle with inlaid eyes, clay tokens shaped like sheep, used perhaps for counting or prayer, burial sites where animals are laid carefully beside humans, not as offerings, but as companions. These are echoes not of domination, but of relationship, of time shared, of lives intertwined, and it is this intimacy, as much as any innovation, that defines the agricultural revolution. Not just the sowing of grain, but the weaving of lives, a new ecology of connection, human and goat, cow and child, dog and firelight. These links form a net strong enough to catch a future, but like any net, it also binds. Dependency grows in both directions. To abandon animals now would mean to abandon the system itself. This is no longer a choice, it is a commitment, a contract written not in ink, but in milk and blood and shared breath. And yet, there is something beautiful in that surrender. To walk the same paths each year, not because you must, but because you care for what walks beside you. To rise in the night because a ewe is labouring in the cold. To wait patiently for the sow to eat from your hand. These are acts of patience, of empathy, of deep time understanding that survival is not conquest, but connection. Still, not all is ease. With dependence comes risk. A failed lambing season can starve a family. Disease in the herd can collapse a village economy. Theft and raiding become constant threats. And sometimes, animals suffer under human hands, not from cruelty always, but from need, from ignorance, from desperation. The ethical question that first stirred in the early days of domestication remains unresolved. What do we owe to the lives we shape? It is a question that stretches far beyond the Neolithic, echoing through every era that followed. It whispers through the pens of ancient Mesopotamia, through the stables of Egypt, through the pastures of medieval Europe and into the feedlots of today. The domesticated animal is not a relic. It is still with us. It sleeps at our feet. It pulls our carts. It feeds our children. It waits behind fences, looking through wire with patient eyes. And we, descendants of the first herders, still carry the burden and the blessing of that gaze. Because to tame is not to master. It is to take responsibility. And in the ancient bargain struck between human and animal, we see ourselves, both wild and weary, needing and needed, reshaped by love and by labour. This is the inheritance we carry from the shepherds of 9,000 years ago. Not just the wool and milk, not just the fences and fields, but the quiet, enduring truth that survival is shared. The wild hearts still beat among us, and in listening to them, we remember who we were, who we still are. The wolves begin as circles in the dust. Long before they hold back enemies, they hold in meaning. They trace the limits of intention, the places where people choose not to move on. At first, they are little more than stones stacked around sleeping spaces, fences woven from reeds, ditches dug with bare hands. But something has changed. People are no longer just staying, they are building. They are shaping the world not only to shelter themselves, but to declare presence, permanence, and a claim. What happens when stillness becomes structure? On a high mound above the desert, the remains of Jericho whisper their answer. One of the oldest continuously inhabited sites on Earth, this place, nearly 12,000 years old, was no longer a camp or a seasonal shelter. It had become a village, and then something more, a proto-city, dense with signs of coordination and vision. Its massive stone wall, built long before the advent of pottery, looms large in our archaeological memory. Not a defence against war, perhaps, but against flood, wind, or even the pull to keep moving. What must it have felt like to gather in its shadow, to see a human-made horizon where once there had been only sky. The city is not just an invention of architecture, but of time. In Çatalhöyük, in the Anatolian plateau, homes press close together like bricks in a forgotten mosaic. There are no streets, only rooftops. To enter your neighbour's home, you walk across your own. To visit a shrine, you descend through a trapdoor. Everything is layered, walls upon walls, burials beneath floors, symbols carved into plaster and painted in ochre, layer upon layer of memory, deliberately built into the bones of the place. Why did they build this way, crowding together with such intimacy, such density? Because something powerful was happening. Farming had created food. Food had created stability. And stability had made room for planning, for ritual, for remembering. These were no longer families sheltering from the wind, but societies orchestrating their own rhythms, designing their lives around place and people rather than prey and season. But what does a place become when it is too large for everyone to know one another's names? The answer emerges in roles. A community of 10 can share everything. A community of 1,000 cannot. So slowly, quietly, differences appear, not in wealth, yet, but in task. One person becomes the keeper of seeds, another watches the skies, another speaks for the dead. The grain surplus is counted, the ovens are tended, the herds are managed. Over time, those who manage begin to organize those who labor, and organization demands story. Who decides how things are shared? Who claims to know what the gods want? These questions are not answered by consensus. They are answered by symbols, shrines, and systems of belief that turn survival into meaning. What had once been a group becomes a world. What must it feel like to wake up one morning and realize your village no longer fits within your voice? To walk the same path your ancestors did, but now find yourself asking permission to cross a threshold. To see a wall, not as protection from the wild, but as separation from another's claim. In the expansion of community, something subtle begins to retreat. The certainty that everyone is equal in need and memory. And in its place grows a structure more rigid than stone. Hierarchy. It is not invented all at once. It grows as naturally as a tree seeking sunlight. In the early farming villages, surplus becomes the seed. When one household has more grain than it needs, it stores it. When another has less, it borrows. And when it cannot repay, it owes. Not just food, but allegiance. And slowly power is born, not through violence, but through favour. The keeper of surplus becomes the centre of exchange. And from that centre, a new shape of society emerges. In Çatalhöyük, there are no grand palaces, no wide avenues, no royal tombs. But we begin to see patterns. Some houses are larger, more decorated. Some burials have more offerings. Figurines appear, fat-bodied, often female, often placed near hearths or in walls. These may not be queens or priestesses, but they suggest someone is watching over the grain. Someone is tending more than just fire and food. Whether divine or human, the figure holds attention, and attention becomes influence, and influence becomes structure. By the time we arrive at later sites, like Tell Sultan, the site of ancient Jericho, organization is no longer implicit. It is carved, built, painted. Defensive towers rise. Storage facilities are centralized. Some areas of the settlement are walled off from others. Control is now physical, visible, inescapable. With permanence comes boundary, and with boundary comes negotiation. Who may enter? Who must stay out? These early villages, once shaped by rivers and seasons, are now shaped by agreements, by customs, by rule. And rules need rule makers. Some rise as coordinators, others as spiritual leaders, some as warriors or protectors. Specialization has emerged, not only in work but in status. The child of a potter is more likely to shape clay than to herd goats. Memory becomes vocational. Skills are inherited not only in practice but in permission. This is both efficiency and enclosure. As society grows, so too does dependence on roles, and with dependence comes fragility. When a harvest fails, it is not just the farmer who suffers, it is the entire village. So systems are created, protocols, offerings, early taxation perhaps, labour quotas, and rituals, not just spiritual but social. The first steps toward formal governance are not charters or laws, but meals, marriages, burials, shared acts that reinforce belonging. Because something larger than a family is now being born, a culture, and at its centre people begin to build spaces not for sleeping, but for gathering. Shrines, temples, open courtyards. These are the heartbeats of the proto-city, the places where meaning is made. Within these spaces walls speak. Painted with animals, hands and symbols, they echo stories that are not only heard but seen. At Çatalhöyük, one room stands out among the rest. A shrine, its walls decorated with bull skulls and plastered breasts, painted leopards and vultures. It is not a home, but it is part of a home, woven into the fabric of daily life. Ritual is not separate from work here. It pulses beneath it, around it, through it. You do not go to the temple. The temple lives beside you, above your sleeping mat, beneath your feet. In these sanctified spaces, fertility becomes a theme, not just of reproduction, but of life's renewal. The crops that grow, the animals that carve, the earth that keeps giving if honoured. Figurines, often interpreted as fertility idols, are tucked into walls, into grain bins, into tombs. The meaning of these figures is debated by archaeologists, but their presence is certain. Humans are now creating symbols to hold the weight of hope. Because with agriculture came unpredictability, not freedom from hunger, but new forms of it. Drought, blight, disease. If one field fails, it can starve hundreds. And so, prayer takes root beside the plough. Ritual becomes resilience. What began as observation of the natural world becomes negotiation with the unseen, the spirits of grain, the ancestors who must be remembered, the gods who must be fed so they, in turn, feed us. Burial practices deepen this relationship. At Çatalhöyük, the dead are often buried beneath houses, beneath the sleeping areas, beneath the hearth. They remain in the community, not as ghosts, but as continuities. Some bodies are later exhumed, their skulls plastered and painted, then placed in shrines or alcoves. These are not acts of horror but of memory, a visible, physical link to lineage. You sleep not alone, but upon the bones of those who walked before you. This intimacy with death shapes life, because to bury beneath your home is to accept that permanence is an illusion, that even stone walls will crumble, that roofs will cave, that the city will one day be buried as well. And yet still you build, still you paint, still you sing the old songs and press your palms into wet plaster. The village becomes a world not because it endures forever, but because it holds everything while it lasts. The sacred and the mundane, the child's cry and the elder's prayer. And so, meaning becomes layered, just like the settlement itself. Each generation adds a new flaw, a new symbol, a new rule. The city becomes its own memory, stratified into mud, brick and ash, pigment and bone. The living walk atop the dead, who once walked atop their own dead. This is not morbid, it is ancestral, it is grounding. It reminds each person that they are part of something larger, a story not yet finished. But with each layer, complexity grows, and complexity brings new questions. How do you balance the needs of many when the voices grow too numerous to count? How do you resolve disputes in a place where memory no longer connects everyone directly, where not all who gather at the hearth remember the same beginning? As villages expand into proto-cities, the human social brain reaches its threshold. Intuition and tradition are no longer enough. Structures must evolve, not only of stone, but of behaviour. This is the quiet birth of governance. We do not yet find thrones, armies, or written decrees, but we find central buildings larger than any home. We find shared courtyards swept clean. We find patterns of ritual repetition, signs that certain people led while others followed. The social fabric tightens, not as a web of equals, but as a hierarchy of responsibility, or perhaps of power. The keeper of the calendar becomes essential. The priestess who knows the rites of planting cannot be questioned. The man who leads the hunt now allocates the meat. And so, Leadership emerges. It is not yet rule in the modern sense. It is still embedded in community, still relational. But it marks the beginning of a symmetry. Status once tied to wisdom or spiritual access begins to tangle with control, over resources, over information, over people. And from that tangle, systems are born, some to protect, others to command. The duality of human society, cooperation and competition, rises like twin towers from the same foundation. Material evidence grows with the centuries. In the later Neolithic layers at sites like Tel Halaf or Tel Brak, we find specialized workshops, separate quarters for elites, walled compounds, tokens and seals, early signs of accounting, of regulated trade. This is no longer merely subsistence, it is surplus, structured, guarded, redistributed. The village has become an organism, and within it, roles have become organs, interdependent, essential, unequal. But even as complexity thickens, the sacred does not disappear. In fact, it expands. Religious practice becomes formalized. Shrines become temples. We find altars stained with pigment and ash. We find votive offerings buried carefully in corners, and always figurines, small, symbolic, charged with mystery. Some wear headdresses, some have animal features, some appear intentionally broken, perhaps as part of ritual. These are not random, they are maps of belief. They guide the living through uncertainty, because the more complex a world becomes, the more it needs story. Rules require myth, hierarchies require justification, and ritual becomes the narrative that threads it all together. Birth, planting, harvest, death. These are no longer private moments. They are communal events, structured, witnessed, remembered. And meaning, once drawn from stars and seasons, is now also drawn from walls and roles. In this world, a child is born into structure. Their path is not formless, but guided. They may grow into a weaver, a carver, a keeper of the hearth, or they may grow into a servant, a leader, a keeper of others' labour. Identity begins to crystallize, and with it, possibility narrows. In the vast openness of a nomadic life, a child could grow to hunt or gather, wander or stay, shift their role with the seasons. But here, in the walls of a village becoming city, the horizon is no longer physical. It is social. It is defined by birth, by task, by the expectations of neighbours and ancestors. This offers security, but also constraint. A farmer's child becomes a farmer. A potter's daughter shapes clay. The rhythms of life are inherited as duty. And yet, even within these narrowing roles, humans continue to imagine. Art flourishes, not grand monuments yet, but intricate personal works. Painted walls, carved bones, engraved beads, stories passed in gesture and song, fertility figurines placed beside hearths, sacred patterns traced in the dust. These are not luxuries but necessities of the spirit. They give shape to the invisible, desire, memory, longing. Even as the physical world is increasingly controlled, the inner world remains wild, seeking expression. Because a village is not only stone and structure, it is yearning, and yearning finds its way into ritual. Burial customs grow more elaborate. The dead are no longer simply laid to rest. They are adorned, positioned, sometimes even returned to the earth in stages, flesh left to decay before bones are gathered, painted, and preserved. It is as if death itself must be understood not only biologically but communally. The soul, the name, the place of the person, these must be honoured, situated, remembered. And so, memory becomes an institution. Elders carry stories, shrines carry echoes. The village becomes an archive of its own becoming. Each generation adds another layer of walls, of customs, of meaning. And from these layers, the first myths are born, not just of gods and spirits, but of origins, who we are, why we stay, what holds us together. The hunter who once walked by starlight now kneels in a room without windows, pressing his hands into wet clay, seeking something beyond grain and water. In these moments, humanity crosses an invisible threshold. We are no longer simply adapting to the land. We are reshaping it, and in doing so, reshaping ourselves. From the scattered camps of the Ice Age, we have arrived at the edge of the city. From fires under the stars to ovens buried in courtyards. From tracking herds to counting harvests. From kinship to culture. And yet, something ancient still lingers. A whisper of the forest, the memory of rivers, the ache for movement. This ache will not disappear. It will become story, song, resistance. Because even as villages become worlds, the human heart remembers the wilderness, and in that remembering we carry forward both burden and gift, the power to build and the cost of what we leave behind. The walls rise, but so do the questions. Who are we now? And what happens next, when the harvest fails, or the river shifts, or the gods go silent? What does it mean to belong to something too large to know? The answers lie ahead, carved into the bones of history. It begins with a field, not one of grass or wildflowers, but of wheat, golden and swaying, anchored by invisible lines drawn in soil. And for the first time, someone calls it theirs. Land, which once belonged to no one and to everyone, becomes defined, claimed, bounded, protected. A woven fence, a buried marker stone. A name whispered over soil before the rains. Ownership, once an alien concept, begins to shape how humans see the world, and each other. A harvest is no longer a gift from nature. It is an asset, a possession, a legacy. It must be guarded, stored, passed on. Not just from hand to hand, but from generation to generation. Property becomes lineage. Lineage becomes power. But what happens when power has edges? A field cannot move. A granary cannot run. They must be defended. And so the first weapons are lifted not to chase prey, but to protect the imagined borders of home. Raids, once brief skirmishes over territory or animals, now take on a new form, organised, premeditated, devastating. What was once survival becomes strategy. Communities erect walls, not just to keep the wild out, but to keep other humans at bay. The architecture of fear becomes embedded in mud, brick and stone. Does abundance invite violence, or does it merely change its shape? When the rains falter, when the river shifts, when the soil grows tired, what options remain for those whose entire lives are tied to the land they cannot abandon? Land that once gave freely now demands a cost. Soil, once rich from centuries of natural cycling, begins to thin under the relentless demands of cultivation. Trees fall to clear new space, but their roots no longer hold the hills. Deforestation begins not as a decision, but as a habit. The world itself starts to ache beneath the weight of this new experiment. And still, the plough cuts deeper. Ownership creates exclusion. Inheritance begets hierarchy. The farmer with 2 fields feeds more mouths than the one with none. Those who have surplus gain not only food, but leverage. Debt emerges, not as a coin, but as a concept. You owe me. And with it, a new kind of hunger spreads. The hunger not just for bread, but for control. How do you divide something that once belonged to all? With each harvest, the seeds of inequality deepen their roots, and yet no one stops, because to stop is to starve, and to starve is to disappear. So the villagers press forward, unaware that the abundance they chase is already transforming them, not just in the back-breaking rhythms of threshing and storing, but in the very way they imagine worth, identity, and belonging. The land gives, but at a price that is no longer measured only in labour. The cost of control is not merely physical, it is philosophical. What does it mean to possess the earth? And what happens when the earth begins to remember? When soil, scraped and planted season after season, hardens into something unresponsive, no longer the soft cradle of seeds, but the exhausted shell of a field overworked. In the early days of farming, people do not yet know the language of nutrients, nitrogen, or erosion, but they know when the land is tired. The wheat grows thinner. The barley bends weakly in the wind. Lentils become fewer. So they do what humans have always done. They move. But now it's no longer small bands wandering between rivers and groves. Now it is families, entire lineages, tied to houses, graves, and inherited fields. And moving means conflict. To leave land is to lose it. To claim new land is to take it from someone else. Conflict becomes a rhythm, like harvest or planting, not constant, but expected, part of the cycle of ownership. Raids begin at the edge of dawn, shadows against fields ripe for taking. Food stores are stolen, fields are burned, animals are driven off. What was once a neighbour becomes an invader. And in response, villages respond not with abandonment, but with walls. Jericho's great stone tower, built nearly 10,000 years ago, may have been a flood barrier, or a symbol of unity, or a defence against hostile groups. Perhaps it was all three. What matters is the intention behind it. We are here, and this place is ours. In that declaration lies both safety and separation. A wall does not just keep danger out, it keeps the inhabitants in. Behind it, they are bound to one another, by need, by fear, by the thin line of stone between survival and loss. Walls reshape identity. A person is no longer simply human. They are of this place, this settlement, this lineage. Outsiders become strangers. Strangers become threats. And where threat exists, so does the need for those who train to meet it. The first warriors are born, not hunters of animals, but hunters of men. They do not chase, they defend. They do not bring meat back to the hearth. They guard the grain beneath it. But every defence is also a confession. It admits that there is something to lose. Ownership is a risk as much as it is a reward. And the land itself, silent, patient, still bears witness. Forests recede as villages grow. Trees become beams for roofs, firewood for ovens, timber for ploughs and wheels. In their absence, rain washes the soil into rivers, turning them brown and full. Once clear streams now flood when it rains, and vanish when it does not. Water must be guided, channeled, diverted, commanded. Irrigation begins as a gift to the fields, but soon becomes a point of conflict. Whose water flows first? Who decides when the gates open? Who owns the river? This is where control deepens, not only of land, but of time, of resources, of people. A system is forming, unequal, fragile, necessary. And within it, the human heart begins to feel a different kind of hunger, not for meat or berries or warmth, but for certainty, for permanence, for peace. But can peace exist in a world built on possession? Or is conflict simply the shadow cast by the first fence built around a field of grain? Even now, in the stillness of an early morning mist rolling through an ancient valley, we can imagine it, the invisible lines that crisscross the land. Ownership, control, legacy. These ideas were not born fully formed. They emerged slowly, entangled with survival, shaped by fear and desire. But once named, they grew roots. The moment someone says, "This is mine," a second moment follows, and that is not yours. It is here that inequality blossoms. When land is fixed and surplus can be stored, hierarchy can take root. Those who manage the granaries begin to wield influence, not through brute force, but through access, coordination, negotiation. A new kind of power arises, managerial, symbolic, bureaucratic. The seed sower and the seed counter no longer share the same role, and over time, they no longer share the same status. Inheritance formalizes these divisions. Children are no longer born simply into a family, they are born into a structure, a rank, a destiny. The rich inherit land, tools, even workers. The poor inherit dependence. Choice, once defined by mobility and knowledge of wild places, is now shaped by proximity to wealth. And as roles calcify, mobility, both literal and social, fades. But the earth does not stop for human plans. It continues to shift, cycle, resist. In many early farming societies, ecological strain appears long before written history. Forests cleared for fuel and farmland don't regenerate. Rain patterns change. Soil, repeatedly tilled and exposed, begins to lose its life. Without animal manure or rotational crops, nutrients leach away. What once was abundance becomes fragility, and so the cycle accelerates. More labour is required to produce the same yield. Larger areas are needed to feed the same village. Rivers must be redirected, hills terraced, marshes drained. Technology steps in, not as a marvel, but as a necessity. Irrigation channels are dug by hand. Dikes and levees are maintained year after year. The community becomes bound not just to place, but to infrastructure. A collapse of canals is no longer a nuisance. It is a threat to survival. The land, like the people, becomes burdened, and when one village's land fails, another's might still flourish. So conflict continues, fiercer now, more organised. Fortified granaries, standing militias, the invention of siege. Peace becomes something that must be negotiated, brokered, enforced. And with enforcement, yet another kind of power is born: law. We see the first codes, not yet written in stone, but etched in expectation. Rules about fields, theft, inheritance, marriage. These are not only about order, they are about stability in a world that no longer offers it freely. Humans, having wrested control from nature, now find themselves needing control over each other. And so society becomes a system of management, of people, of resources, of behaviour. It is not evil. It is simply the shape that complexity takes. But the more tightly we grip the reins of control, the more we must ask, who holds them, and what do they sacrifice to do so? At first, perhaps nothing more than time, some measure of freedom. But as the system matures, sacrifice deepens. The leaders of these early societies must carry more than grain or rule books. They carry the tension between the people and the land, between hope and hunger. Every decision weighs not only on their shoulders, but on the soil beneath them. A misjudged irrigation schedule might cost a village its crop. A failed negotiation with a neighbour might spark a conflict no one returns from. To lead is to live at the centre of the storm, but those who lead are not always those who labour. As agricultural societies expand, specialisation appears. Not everyone needs to farm, at least not directly. Some become potters, others toolmakers. A few become priests, whose duties are no longer just to the people, but to the unseen forces believed to govern fertility, rain, and fate. The grain that once served the body now also feeds the spirit and the social order. Surplus, once a buffer against famine, becomes the currency of class. With every growing season, society stratifies. We begin to see grave goods buried with some, but not all. We see houses grow larger for the few, while others crowd into smaller spaces. Walls inside villages now not only face outward, but inward. Territory shrinks from the expanse of the wild to the narrow corridors of daily life. Social distance becomes physical, and so the cost of control multiplies. It is etched in the bent backs of workers grinding flour from tough einkorn wheat. It echoes in the silence of women who bear children into lives already prescribed by birth. It lives in the fatigue of those who wake before the sun to mend canals, repair fences, watch for raiders, and still no one stops, because there is no way back. The forager's world of movement, flexibility, diversity has become myth. Their knowledge of which roots heal and which fungi kill fades with each generation that no longer walks far from the village. Children grow up beneath ceilings, not stars. Their world is bounded by plots and property, by names and deeds. Their gods now live in temples, not rivers. Nature, once a partner in the dance of survival, becomes something to be subdued. We clear it, burn it, fence it. We name its parts and tally its outputs. Even beauty is measured. The tallest ox, the most symmetrical barley head, the straightest furrow. Wildness is no longer revered, it is corrected. Yet still, in the quiet corners of fields, something resists. A weed that breaks through stone. A bird that feeds on spilled grain. A child who wanders past the boundary line and returns with a story. Control, no matter how vast, is never total. The earth whispers this truth in every season of flood and drought, in every pest that eats through stores, in every cracked terrace and silted canal. It reminds us, gently, patiently, relentlessly, that it was never fully ours to begin with. And perhaps that is the most difficult realization of it all, that the abundance we chased came at the price of simplicity, that the certainty we longed for required walls, not just around our homes, but around our minds, that to feed the body we began to bind the spirit. By the later Neolithic, the human landscape has changed beyond recognition. From Anatolia to the Indus, from the Nile to the Danube, Great systems now ripple through the land: irrigation networks, grain stores, workshops, temples. But beneath the surface, tension grows. Soil is not infinite. Rivers silt. Forests shrink. And people, too, stretch the limits of what they can endure. Food is no longer a daily adventure. It is a cycle of planning and fear. A missed planting window can mean ruin. A failed harvest might lead to famine, debt, or dependence on those with more. Grain, once shared freely among kin, now becomes the measure of labour, loyalty, and control. We find tablets, early accounting records marking rations, debts, offerings. They are marvels of ingenuity, the first steps toward writing. But they are also signs of a world where human life is tallied, a world where loss becomes quantifiable. Even time begins to serve the system. Calendars, born from careful observation of the stars, are refined not for myth, but for yield. When to plant, when to reap, when to store. Time becomes a ledger, and so, the journey that began with a seed pressed into soil becomes something vast, beautiful, burdensome, irreversible, but not without moments of reflection. We find figurines buried near granaries, perhaps offerings, perhaps warnings. We see ritual hearths burned anew each year, as if to begin again. We glimpse paintings carved not for function, but feeling. And in these, perhaps a quiet rebellion, the refusal to forget where we came from. For even in the age of control, memory lives on, in stories told by firelight of the ancestors who walked with the animals, in the wind that moves across a fallow field, reminding us of the forests that once stood there, in the wild grain that still grows at the edge of the irrigation ditch, untamed, unmeasured. So what, then, is the cost of control? It is the ache in the back and the fear in the stomach. It is the weight of walls, of titles, of lineage. It is the trade of wild wonder for measured security. And yet, it is also the cradle of all that would come after: cities, writing, music, law, art. Without control there is no civilization, but without wildness there is no soul. This is the paradox that hums through the human story, not as a failure, but as a question. One we are still trying to answer. And as we press our fingers once again into the soil, in gardens, in fields, in dreams, we're still listening for the echo of that first decision: to stay, to grow, to build, and to bear the weight of what we create. For the first time in human history, the shape of civilization no longer followed the herds. It followed the seed. Farming had begun as a quiet wager with the earth, a whisper pressed into soil, a plea for return. Now, it was no longer a question of if it would work. It had worked. And yet, what began as a tentative experiment in the lands we now call the Fertile Crescent was not destined to remain there. From the banks of the Euphrates to the yellow floodplains of the Yangtze, from the mountain valleys of the Andes to the river deltas of the Niger, humans were asking the same question in different tongues. What else might grow here, under our care? But how could so many distant peoples, separated by vast oceans, mountains, and deserts, have reached similar answers without ever speaking to one another? This is one of the great mysteries of deep time, the independent invention of agriculture across at least 6 distinct centres, each with its own suite of plants, its own tempo, its own sacred rhythms. In the Near East it was emmer and incorn wheat, barley, chickpeas, lentils. In the valleys of China, humans bent their backs to wild rice and broomcorn millet, drawn to the marshes and terraces where grains clung stubbornly to the earth. In the lowlands of Mesoamerica, they nursed teosinte into maize, a feat so improbable, so slow, that it remains one of the most astonishing acts of guided evolution in our species' history. In the Andes, potatoes, buried treasure in frostbitten soil, were pulled from their rocky cradles and carried in woven slings. In sub-Saharan Africa, the silent resilience of sorghum, yams, and pearl millet became the foundation of lives attuned to the pulse of the savannah. And in New Guinea, in dense, humid forests, taro, banana, and sugarcane emerged from under the canopy, not as fruit of wild chance but of long attention. This was not the spread of an idea. It was the convergence of a pattern. What does it mean when different minds in different places shaped by different stars come to echo the same solutions? Is it necessity, destiny, or something buried even deeper in the marrow of what it means to be human? This parallel unfolding of agriculture was not driven by a single origin myth, but by many small epics, quiet, local dramas of observation, experimentation, and faith in the unseen. But not all crops were created equal. Some offered sweetness, others sustenance. Some grew where water stood still, others where winds howled down from high places. Each became more than food, they became identity. Rice was not wheat. Maize was not barley. The land chose, and people listened. And so, a strange truth began to emerge, whispered through millennia. Though agriculture tethered people to place, it did not isolate them. It connected them invisibly across the curvature of the earth, not through caravans or conquests, not yet, but through something older, more patient, the slow pulse of exchange. At first glance, early farming cultures appear insular, bound to their own valleys and rivers, hemmed in by mountain ranges or seas. But beneath the surface, evidence tells another story. Buried in the floors of Neolithic homes, we find obsidian, volcanic glass that gleams like frozen lightning, sourced from quarries hundreds of kilometers away. In desert caves, we find beads carved from marine shells. In forest clearings, we uncover stones that do not belong to the local geology. And in each of these, we glimpse a truth. People have always carried pieces of distant worlds with them. They did not yet have roads, but they had roots, invisible, intuitive, passed down not on paper but through memory, story and footstep. These were the first trade networks, and though they moved slowly, no faster than a person could walk or a canoe could drift, they carried more than goods. They carried knowledge, a sharper blade, a new kind of seed, a healing root, a tale of another people's god. These early exchanges were not about profit, they were about possibility. What might grow here that we have not yet tasted? What tool might last longer than the one we know? What name do others give to the wind, the stars, the harvest? Even language itself begins to soften at the edges where cultures meet. Words are borrowed, rhythms shift, songs echo across hills, changing slightly with each retelling, and always the plants move too. Lentils cross from one valley to the next. Rice follows monsoon trails. Maize leaps over generations from the lowlands of Mexico to the prairies of North America. Bananas slip quietly into African soil from Southeast Asia, long before ships arrive to carry flags and iron. These are not the forced marches of empire, but the meandering migrations of hope. In each case the plant changes, and so do the people. Maize, for instance, is not a static invention. It is a slow conversation between plant and planter, reshaped over thousands of years by patient selection. Early maize ears were barely longer than a human thumb, with few rows of kernels. Yet over generations, those who harvested saved the seeds that fed best, stored best, grew strongest. The maize we know today is the result of this ancient dialogue between hand, soil, and sun. The same is true of rice, which began as a wild grain in Chinese wetlands but became, over time, a staple of entire civilizations. Its cultivation demanded precision, rhythm, and teamwork, skills that would echo in the organization of the early societies. Even today, in the flooded paddies of Southeast Asia, the geometry of rice reflects 1,000 years of shared wisdom, carved into the land. So these crops are not merely food, they are archives, living records of human care, migration and adaptation. And like all archives, they contain more than data. They contain meaning, encoded not in ink but in taste and ritual, in harvest songs and planting prayers, in the quiet ways a grandmother teaches her grandchild which seed to keep and which to cast away. Through this, agriculture became more than a system of survival. It became culture. It is here, in this quiet entanglement of food and feeling, that the web begins to deepen. Consider what happens when a single new crop enters a village, a stranger in the field. At first, it might seem unremarkable, a curiosity perhaps. But slowly, if it grows well, it alters everything. A new planting schedule, a different rhythm of labour, a change in storage or cooking, maybe even a new ritual to mark its arrival or thank its spirit. Then, over time, it becomes familiar, and once it is familiar, it becomes identity. Children grow up never knowing a time before this food. It becomes their taste of home. Now imagine this not happening once, but dozens of times. Across rivers, across forests, across whole continents. This is the unseen geometry of early exchange, not the rigid roots of empires, but a lattice of memory and movement, always shifting. In the Fertile Crescent, farming communities passed barley, emmer and sheep across the hills like shared secrets. In the Sahel, yams and millet were exchanged alongside drum rhythms and stories. In Mesoamerica, traders carried cacao and obsidian through mountain passes and jungle trails. In the Andes, llama caravans moved silently across impossible slopes, bearing salt, dried potatoes and woven cloth. And all along these paths there were pauses, campsites that became hamlets, market clearings that became crossroads. People met, danced, traded, sometimes fought, sometimes loved. And every now and then, in those in-between spaces, a seed slipped from one pouch to another. Even those who did not farm directly were drawn into this web. Foragers began to trade for cultivated grains. Pastoralists exchanged wool and cheese for dried fruits and tools. No one remained untouched. The idea of the village, the field, the granary, it all spread like pollen. And yet, for all its reach, this web did not erase difference. Instead, it held diversity like a mosaic. Each region adapted agriculture to its own needs, its own ecologies. Wetlands favoured rice, highlands nurtured tubers, arid plains required drought-resistant grains. What emerged was not a single agricultural story, but a chorus. Many voices, each in harmony with its land. Through this, the human world began to hum with a strange new music, a music of shared sustenance, a music of rootedness and reaching. For with every season that passed and every harvest gathered, humanity's bond to the soil deepened, not just physically but spiritually. Fields were not only tilled, they were blessed. Crops were not merely gathered, they were honoured. Across vast distances, in cultures that had never spoken to one another, we find echoes of the same gestures. Hands raised to the sky in gratitude, offerings buried at the corners of plots, songs sung to ensure the return of rain. The web of agriculture was not a sterile lattice of economics or pragmatism. It was a living, breathing fabric stitched with story, myth and reverence. In the Andes, maize was not just a crop. It was a sacred being, a companion through time. In ancient China, rice was linked to the moon's rhythm and the emperor's virtue. In Mesoamerica, the gods themselves were believed to have formed humanity from cornmeal dough. These beliefs were not quaint. They were the scaffolding upon which early civilizations built their relationship with the world. And they had to believe, because farming, for all its promise, was still a gamble. Floods, droughts, pests, unexpected frosts. These could turn a season of labour into a winter of hunger. So faith was not optional. It was essential. Not blind belief, but an active, embodied trust in the continuity of life, in the possibility of return. The seed disappears into the earth, and for days, nothing. Then a green thread rises. That moment, the crossing from absence to presence, was a kind of resurrection, and it touched something deep in the human soul. It also created a new kind of time. Hunter-gatherers lived by movement, tracking cycles of game and bloom. But farmers began to measure time in static repetitions. When to plough, when to sow, when to weed, when to reap. Calendars emerged, often rooted in stars and seasons. In Egypt, the Nile's floods set the clock. In the Indus, the monsoon. In Mesopotamia, the rising of Sirius. Across these early cultures, time became grain-shaped, soil-stained, and celestial. As agriculture settled into the heart of humanity, new forms of memory were required. No longer was knowledge held only in the minds of elders. It had to be shared across generations in ways that would not be forgotten. Carved into stone, baked into pottery, sung into lullabies, etched into the grooves of ancient tools. This was the dawn of information systems. Preliterate, yes, but precise. The first farming manuals were not scrolls but rituals, and as fields expanded, so did relationships. More land meant more neighbours, more crops meant more mouths, more labour meant more coordination. The web, once a loose net of exchanges, became taut with the weight of obligation and opportunity. Paths between communities hardened into trade routes, goods became currency, agreements became law. The social web thickened, binding together people who had never before needed to cooperate or compete. It was no longer just a matter of what one could grow. It was a matter of what one could trade, protect, store, or share. And in that quiet shift, from sustenance to surplus, from cooperation to calculation, the web of agriculture became a force not only of nourishment, but of transformation. It no longer simply tethered people to the land. It tethered them to one another in systems of obligation and exchange, of trust and tension. Across continents, agriculture drew invisible lines between communities, lines that could become lifelines or fault lines. In some places, those lines thickened into lifeways so interconnected that entire regions pulsed with coordinated rhythms. Salt from one valley was exchanged for grain from another. Clay vessels carried oil across arid landscapes. Wooden tools were bartered for dried fruit, pigment, or honey. Even before the rise of great cities, the groundwork for global interdependence was laid, step by step, seed by seed. But these were not purely economic relationships. They were also emotional ones. To trade was to trust, to believe that the person on the other side of the mountain or the bend in the river also had needs, also had stories, also waited for the rains. Exchange became a form of recognition, and sometimes through this recognition peace bloomed. Marriages were arranged across villages, festivals were shared. New customs emerged at the borders between peoples. A hybrid humanity was taking root. Still, the web brought more than harmony. Where abundance accumulated, so too did envy. Where borders were drawn, they were also tested. Where one crop thrived, another might fail. And in the push and pull of these tensions, agriculture became something more than a method. It became a system with consequences. Unequal harvests led to unequal power. A village with surplus grain could feed soldiers, could build walls, could withhold or grant favour. A simple sack of seeds could decide the fate of a season or a generation. Yet even in these complexities, something remarkable endured. Agriculture remained, above all else, a conversation with the earth. No matter how far the network stretched, or how complicated the systems grew, each plant still had to germinate in soil, draw water, and reach for light. Each harvest still depended on the quiet work of weather, worm, and root. And each person, whether in the highlands of Peru or the valleys of the Yangtze, still bent low to the ground, placing faith in the possibility of growth. In this way, the spread of agriculture across continents was not just a historical fact. It was a spiritual unfolding, a moment when humanity, having once roamed freely across the face of the world, chose instead to anchor itself, and in doing so, discovered a new kind of freedom, not in wandering, but in weaving connections across distances, weaving cultures into ecosystems, weaving meaning into the very act of feeding one another. The web continues today, in every grain of rice cooked on a stove, in every loaf of bread broken at a table, in every seed planted by a trembling hand. And through it, we are still learning what it means to be rooted and to belong. The fields stretch wide and golden under a sun that no longer dictates when to move on, but when to reap. Here, in these measured rows of grain, one can sense the weight of something irreversible. And now, after all this time, the question rises like mist from the earth itself. Did we shape this world, or did this world silently shape us? When the first seeds were pushed into the soil, it seemed like an act of control. The old hunter's world was one of uncertainty, of chasing the wild, of not knowing if the next valley held sustenance or silence. But the world of planting offered the illusion of foresight. To place a seed in the ground was to ask the future for a promise, and to believe, perhaps for the first time, that it might be kept. But promises demand payment. And over generations the payment came not just in labour, or in the aching backs of those who bent to the earth, but within the bodies themselves. Those who ate the same grains year after year found themselves reshaped by what they consumed. A small mutation in the gene for amylase, the enzyme that helps digest starch, spread like a quiet whisper through populations that lived by wheat and barley. Another mutation, one that allowed the digestion of milk beyond infancy, emerged not once but several times in distant pockets of humanity. It was a convergence, a genetic bowing to the altar of the farm. What happens when your biology no longer serves only survival, but obedience? The body, once forged for endurance and the chase, became a machine for processing grain. Teeth wore down not from chewing meat, but from grinding stones hidden in flour. Bones narrowed, statures shrank. The great mosaic of genetic diversity that once danced freely across wide, wandering populations began to narrow into patterns of domesticated adaptation. And still, the harvest was seen as victory. Was it? There is something both intimate and unsettling in the idea that a grass, wheat, is among the most successful organisms on Earth not because of its wildness, but because of its manipulation of us. We protect it, we water it, we tear down forests to give it light. In return, it sustains our numbers, but it also demands our loyalty. Its survival and ours became intertwined, so much so that it is hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. And what does that mean? For choice? For agency? For freedom? When evolution ceases to be a passive inheritance and becomes a reaction to one's own designs, a mirror appears, one that does not reflect who we once were, but who we are becoming. In the genetics of the farmer's child lies the whisper of a plant's ambition, in the persistence of lactase, in the multiplication of starch-digesting enzymes, in the narrowing of pelvic bones and the onset of diseases of abundance. There is a ghost in the genome, and it is agricultural. Who, then, was truly domesticated? Who held the leash, and who, in silence, held the gaze? As the viewer steps deeper into this revelation, a second kind of memory begins to emerge, not one carried in genes, but in geography. The Earth itself became a vast and living archive of human intention. Each furrowed field, each stone terrace clinging to a hillside, each canal etched through sun-baked clay is not just infrastructure. It is a sentence in an ancient dialogue between mind and matter. These are not ruins. They are thoughts, inscribed into land. The straight rows of wheat stretching through the Fertile Crescent are more than efficient design. They are an echo of a desire for predictability. The zigzagging terraces in the Andes are not merely soil conservation. They are expressions of vertical logic, of an understanding that water, sun, and altitude must be orchestrated like instruments in a symphony. Across the valleys of the Yellow River, the rise of paddy fields was not an accident. It was a reflection of centuries spent watching how water moves, how rice thrives, how patience feeds. In this way, the landscape itself became a kind of external brain. Where once memory was passed through story alone, held in songlines, in campfire tales, in the deep inflections of oral tradition, it now took root in form. A canal remembered how to redirect the spring floods. A storage pit remembered the surplus of the year before. A wall remembered the raids of neighbours, and a shrine remembered the mystery of the harvest. Memory no longer needed to live only in minds. It was embedded in materials, in arrangements, in space itself. And with this shift came a slow unravelling of the ephemeral. In a world of constant motion, forgetting had been survival. The mammoth hunter did not need to recall the exact shape of last season's weather, only where the wind carried the herd. But now, the weather had to be recorded, patterns tracked, calendars invented. The sky became a ledger. Time was carved into moon cycles, shadows, stars. To forget could mean famine. To remember became sacred. But remembering changed what it meant to live. In fixed memory there is fixed expectation. In a wall there is exclusion. In a granary there is ownership. In a field there is a season that must be obeyed. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the freedom once found in forgetting gave way to the security of the known. It is easy to see this shift as progress, but it is also a tether, for the land began to hold not only our food, but our responsibilities. To leave a field was to abandon work. To neglect a canal was to endanger the village. The earth no longer merely provided, it required. It was no longer wild, it was co-authored. And as this co-authorship deepened, so too did the commitments it demanded. The cost was not only physical or genetic, it was existential. For in the writing of memory into land, we had to let go of a different kind of knowing, one born not from plans but from presence. The knowing of the migratory trail, the scent of weather in the wind, the silence before a predator strikes. What we gained in memory, we paid for in immediacy, and what we built in permanence, we traded for the gift of forgetting. The question, then, no longer rests solely in biology or architecture. It hums in the spaces between choices, in the quiet trade-offs that shaped a new human reality. What did we give away? Quietly, slowly, without even realizing, when we chose to plant. This is not a condemnation. It is an invitation to look closely. To notice that beneath the celebration of abundance something else stirred, something difficult to name. Because in the grand ledger of agriculture, for every gain there was a subtraction. Where once there had been wandering, there was now anchoring. Where there had been communal foraging, there was now private land. Where there had been sharing around a fire, there were now measurements, balances, debts. And with these changes came a gradual tightening, not just of labour, but of possibility. A field must be defended, a storehouse must be guarded, a boundary must be drawn. And so, the mind began to shape itself around new concerns: ownership, storage, inheritance. The rhythms of the body began to align with the rhythms of sowing and reaping. Childhood became apprenticeship. Elders became memory keepers. Women and men began to be divided not just by roles, but by tasks assigned by the calendar and the soil. This is the cost we rarely speak of, that freedom, once scattered across a landscape of abundance, was narrowed into a single axis. Control. The control of seeds, of livestock, of labour, of land. And yet, beneath this control, a strange unease remained. Because farming was never a guarantee. Floods came, pests came, droughts lingered like ghosts. And when the crops failed, the illusion of mastery cracked. One bad season could undo years of careful work. One plague could empty a village. One shift in weather could redraw the map of what was habitable. The stability that agriculture promised was always conditional. But that condition was hidden beneath the comfort of routine. It is this paradox that haunts the return to our question. We tethered ourselves to the earth for safety, but we remained just as vulnerable as before. Only now we had less room to move. In the past, when the herds vanished, the people followed. Now when the rains failed, there was nowhere to go. The land held them. The walls kept them in. The soil they once chose to trust now defined the limits of their lives. This is the quiet cost, not a catastrophe, not a tragedy, but a gentle, almost invisible narrowing of the possible. We became caretakers of the land, but also its captives. We made fields of plenty, but also fields of obligation, and in return, the earth held us. Not just physically, but emotionally. It became the keeper of our hopes, our lineage, our gods. We knelt before it with prayers, not as wanderers seeking favour, but as settlers who had made a pact. The pact was this: in exchange for life, we would stay. And we did. Generation after generation, we stayed. Roots, once a metaphor for belonging, became literal. The land no longer just fed us, it defined us. Identities took shape around rivers, valleys, mountains. A village was no longer a camp, it was a lineage, a memory bank, a claim. Our names, our stories, our gods, they all began to mirror the places we could no longer leave. This was not merely survival, it was transformation. But as the transformation deepened, the old self, the one shaped by fluid movement, by shifting seasons, by impermanence, began to fade into myth. The hunter became an echo, the wanderer a cautionary tale. Why leave? The fields asked. Why risk what is already in your hands? Yet even as villages grew and crops multiplied, Even as children inherited their parents' lands and learned to read the soil like scripture, something flickered beneath the surface. A restlessness, an unease that could not be ploughed under. It lived in dreams, in old songs, in the way elders still remembered the paths of stars, even though no one followed them anymore. It whispered in the stillness of fields after harvest, in the hush of winter, when the land slept and the people waited. It whispered of a time when waiting was wandering, and food was found, not made. This whisper was not nostalgia. It was memory, ancestral, instinctive, buried deep in the fabric of who we had been for tens of thousands of years. Because the shift to farming, however permanent it seemed, was recent in the grand stretch of human time. For over 95% of our species' existence, we did not farm. We moved. We read the land like a book always in motion. We understood hunger not as failure, but as invitation to adapt, to travel, to change. Our bodies, our minds, our stories were tuned to flux, to the freedom of not knowing where the next meal would come from, and trusting somehow that it would come. When agriculture arrived, it asked us to trade that trust for planning, to replace intuition with repetition, to map out the year in advance, to structure time, to mould our lives to crops that grew in strict seasons. The world stopped moving, and so did we. But inside us something remembered, something that pulsed like an old rhythm behind a new melody. It is this inner tension between the life we left and the life we built that makes the return to the question so urgent. Did we invent farming, or did it invent us? The evidence is everywhere, in our genomes, rewritten by the foods we began to rely on, in our bones, reshaped by tools, by labour, by stillness, in our villages, etched into hillsides and valleys, silent but persistent reminders of the choice we made, or the choice that made us. Because perhaps it wasn't a decision, perhaps it was a drift, not a revolution, but a tide, slow, steady, and inescapable, pulling us in with its gentle insistence, carrying us from the shores of uncertainty to the solid ground of permanence. And like all tides, once it swept in, it was difficult, impossible to push back. The final return to our question is not about blame or even origin. It is about becoming. Because what happened in the slow rise of agriculture was not a singular decision made in a moment, but a cascade of choices, each small, each reasonable, each wrapped in the promise of security. A seed planted, a fence built, a surplus saved, a boundary drawn. Each act of control was also an act of surrender, and together these acts wove a new human story, a story where the earth was no longer just a vast shared place, but a set of fixed territories, a story where food came not from fortune, but from formula, a story where relationships between people, animals, gods, and land were rewritten in the language of permanence, and we changed. We began to live longer, but not always better. We grew in number, but not always in health. We built civilizations, but also walls. We wrote laws, but also hierarchies. We gained mastery, but often lost mystery. Yet in all of this, through the yield and the burden, the safety and the sorrow, we were never truly alone. The wheat, the barley, the rice, the maize, they were changing too. We shaped them, and they shaped us. This is co-evolution in its deepest sense, not simply of species, but of meaning. Fields became thought, irrigation channels became memory, terraces became philosophy. The land held not just seeds but the architecture of the human mind. What we could not carry, we built into the earth, and even as we left the forest and the wild plain behind, we brought fragments with us, in symbols, in stories, in the movements of rituals passed down across generations. The old world was not erased, it was buried, layered beneath the new-like sediment, waiting to be uncovered. And now, here we are, modern humans walking through cities that once began as barley fields, connected by roads that follow ancient animal trails, governed by systems rooted in the first granaries and temples. Still asking quietly, what did we gain? What did we lose? The answer is not simple. It is not meant to be. Farming was not a fall nor a triumph. It was an unfolding, a transformation that carries both wonder and warning, a journey that continues still in every harvest, every garden, every debate about how we live and what we owe to the earth beneath us. The question remains, but so does the beauty of asking it. And in the asking, we remember we are still becoming, still planting, still adapting, still searching for balance in the ancient pact we made with the land, a pact written not in words, but in roots. The field is quiet at dawn. Mist coils low over the furrows, softening the horizon into a watercolour of pale light and stillness. Somewhere, a breeze stirs the green blades just beginning to rise from the soil. They rustle faintly, like whispers remembered from a dream, and for a long moment you, who have come so far, stand at the edge, not as a farmer or a forager, not as a ruler or a rebel, but simply as a human. You look out across the planted earth and feel something familiar and strange blooming inside you. Because this is not just a field, it is a mirror, and what it reflects is the long, aching story of us. How did it come to this? A world of walls, granaries, seed vaults, irrigation canals that gleam like veins under the skin of the planet. A world where food is certainty, and yet hunger still walks in the margins. A world where the forest has retreated and the field has expanded. But at what cost? Beneath the neat rows and the rumbling tractors, there is a deeper truth, one that began when we traded wandering for belonging. When we decided somehow to tether ourselves to the soil. But even now, after 10,000 years of ploughing and planting, something ancient still stirs in the chest, a wildness that refuses to be entirely buried. What remains of the hunter in the farmer's heart? Perhaps it is found in the way your body quickens when you hear the sound of geese overhead, or the way your eyes instinctively track the movement of a deer in the distance, not with hunger, but with recognition. Perhaps it is in the delight of unpredictability, the refusal to be completely governed by routine, or in the quiet thrill of firelight, of storytelling, of sleeping under stars with no roof but sky. These are not just remnants, they are inheritance. The nomad may have vanished from the landscape, but not from the psyche. The instincts that once shaped survival now echo as longing, a faint rhythm beneath the cultivated order of daily life. And yet, that very longing is what made the field possible. Because the first farmers were not tame. They were wild minds trying to understand a wild world. They were not seeking comfort. They were seeking continuity. They were asking, in their own way, what if we could shape the seasons? What if the land could become memory? What if home was not a place we carried on our backs, but something we could grow with our hands? From those questions came rituals. From rituals came rows. From rows came cities, walls, alphabets, armies, archives, but also granaries, gardens, bread, breath. All of it rooted in the same trembling idea, that it is possible to shape nature without destroying ourselves. But was it true? Did the act of shaping change us more than we ever expected? And if so, what do we owe to the fields that now hold our future? The answer is layered, like the soil beneath our feet. In one layer, triumph. In another, burden. It is impossible to walk through the history of agriculture without stepping into both. On the surface, it is easy to marvel. Agriculture has fed civilizations, expanded life expectancy, and enabled the flourishing of science, language, and cities. From wheat came writing, from barley, beer, and community. The humble rice paddies of the East nourished empires. Maize and potatoes cradled entire continents. These crops became lifelines, connecting one generation to the next, one season to the next, one life to another. To farm is to believe in a future you may never see. But deeper down, other truths take root. Agriculture did not come without cost. The same fields that produced abundance also demanded it. They demanded hours bent beneath sun and storm. They demanded obedience to rhythms no longer natural but imposed. And they demanded more from the earth than she could always give. As the rows lengthened, forests fell. As the yields increased, rivers shrank. Fertile soil became dust. Mountains were carved into terraces. Swamps were drained, coastlines reshaped, climates nudged by the very hand that had once been guided by them. In making the earth feed us, we made it answerable to us. But earth, in her own quiet way, keeps score. And so, we stand now in a paradox. We have never been more capable of feeding ourselves, and never more anxious about how long it can last. The Green Revolution gave us surpluses, yes, but also monocultures, pesticide resistance, loss of diversity. The grocery store shelves are full, but the pollinators are vanishing. The tractors are large, but the topsoil is thin. It is not the field's fault. It has always offered what it could. The question is, what are we asking of it? To see farming only as victory is to miss its shadows, but to see only the shadows is to miss its grace. Agriculture was not just a strategy for survival, it was a framework for meaning. In the careful tending of plants, we found metaphors for patience, for renewal, for faith. In the rhythms of sowing and reaping, we built calendars and liturgies. We sang to the rain. We thanked the sun. We learned to wait, not passively, but with intention. We understood that care itself could be sacred, and it is here, in this tension between power and reverence, that the final understanding begins to form. Farming is not just what we do, it is what we are now made of. It lives in our cells, our cultures, our metaphors. It shaped the words we speak, the holidays we celebrate, the ways we divide labour and time. It has shaped how we think about effort, reward, debt, and duty. But can we now shape it in return? Can we imagine a new kind of field, one that heals as much as it gives? To begin answering that question, we must first understand how deeply farming has embedded itself, not only into our lands, but into our minds. The boundaries of a field are no longer just furrows in the soil. They are etched into how we live, how we think, how we relate to each other. This is the inheritance of 10,000 years. We live by seasons, we measure by harvests. Even in the city, even surrounded by concrete, the logic of the field persists. Investment, waiting, yield, repetition. And yet, the future demands something more than repetition. It demands reflection. The old ways, the old crops, the old relationships between human and land, some still serve but others strain. Climate shifts again, populations swell, rivers dry and oceans rise. The planet signals fatigue, and the field, once so stable, begins to blur at its edges. But within this uncertainty, there is also renewal. Across the world, farmers, scientists, and storytellers are revisiting the roots of agriculture, not to romanticize the past, but to reimagine the future. They are asking, what does it mean to farm regeneratively, not extractively? What does it mean to cultivate biodiversity, not just yield? What does it mean to grow food, not just for profit or volume, but for health? For soil, for soul. In the Andes, ancestral terrace systems are being restored, not only because they are beautiful, but because they work. In Africa, women's seed cooperatives are preserving drought-resistant grains that could feed future generations. In India, rice farmers are returning to older planting rhythms that align more closely with local ecologies. On rooftops in cities, new fields bloom, not wide, but vertical, inventive, resilient. This is not a return to the past, it is a return to the question, what kind of relationship do we want to have with the land that feeds us? It is a question that sits quietly beneath every policy debate, every food market, every plate. And it is a question that echoes back to those first fires, those first seeds pressed into damp earth. The choice was never simply about farming. It was about the shape of our days, the purpose of our work, the direction of our longing. Because to tend a field is to make a promise, not only to oneself but to the future. It is a promise of care, of continuity, of patience, and it is a promise that carries weight. The field remembers everything, the rains, the footsteps, the harvests, the neglect. It holds the memory of our intentions as surely as it holds our roots. And now, as we stand at the edge again, this time not of a single field, but of a planetary one, we must decide what we will plant next, not only in soil, but in story. Because stories are seeds too. They shape what we believe is possible. For thousands of years we have told ourselves the story of dominion, that the land exists to serve us, that wilderness must be tamed, that progress means bending nature to our will, and this story has built cities, empires, and nations. But it has also emptied forests, silenced rivers, and driven countless species into memory. What if the next story is different? What if, after all the furrows carved and all the forests cleared, the greatest act of cultivation is not of land, but of relationship? A relationship in which the farmer is not ruler, but steward, in which fields are not battlegrounds between nature and necessity, but places of dialogue, places where listening matters as much as labour, where care is as valued as control. This is not a fantasy. Around the world it is already unfolding. Some farmers speak of soil the way poets speak of sky, alive, breathing, deserving of rest. Others leave parts of their land wild, not out of neglect, but out of respect, understanding that life can only thrive where chaos is allowed to dance alongside order. Shepherds in Spain still follow ancient transhumance routes, moving with the seasons so grasslands can recover. Rice farmers in Japan hold silent ceremonies to thank water before it enters their paddies. In these gestures there is no urgency, no conquest, only continuity. These practices may seem small against the vast machinery of the modern agriculture, but remember, all revolutions begin as whispers. The first seed pressed into soil was a whisper too, and even now the hunter still lives quietly inside the farmer, not as a call to abandon civilization, but as a reminder of humility. The hunter knew the world not as possession, but as gift. Each animal, each river crossing, each berry found in the brush was a moment of grace, not entitlement. To carry that memory forward into the fields is not regression, it is wisdom. So we ask again, what remains of the hunter in us? Perhaps it is the capacity to notice, to kneel and see a single sprout pushing through frost, to pause at twilight when the wind carries the smell of rain, to feel, even for a moment, that we belong not above the world, but within it. And what remains of the farmer? Discipline, care, the courage to plant even when the sky is grey, the willingness to rise before dawn, not for glory but for continuity, the understanding that hope is not a feeling, it is an action. In the end, it is not a choice between hunter and farmer, it is a weaving. The instinct to wander and the instinct to stay are both part of us, and the future will depend on how gently, how wisely we braid them together. That is the final task. To walk forward, holding both the ache of memory and the shape of possibility. The hunter lives in our breath, the sharp awareness, the reverence for movement, the trust in what cannot be stored. The farmer lives in our hands, the calloused palms, the rhythm of tending, the willingness to stay. We are not one or the other, we are both. And the field, silent and ancient, waits for us to understand this. As dawn rises on this imagined field, the air is thick with the scent of damp soil. Somewhere nearby, the first birdsong stirs. A child walks between the rows of young plants, her fingers brushing the leaves. She does not know the names of the people who came before, but she walks where they once knelt, and the earth remembers them. This is where we stand now, not just in a chapter of history, but in the long unfolding of something deeper. The field is not simply where food is grown, it is where we come to terms with who we are. The traces of fire rings, the bones of aurochs, the grooves worn deep in grinding stones, all these remain, scattered across the continents. But they are not just relics. They are questions left for us to answer. Will we farm as conquerors, or as caretakers? Will we feed only our bodies, or also the landscapes we depend on? Will we continue to cultivate a world that is fractured and exhausted, or will we plant stories of wholeness and tend to them with patience? We have learned much on this journey. We have followed the arc of 10,000 years, from the icebound wandering of Paleolithic hunters to the water-fed fields of the Holocene, from accidental seeds to the careful crafting of irrigation canals, from the first fire-hardened sickle to the satellite-tracked tractor, from whispers of possibility to networks spanning continents. And now we return, not to the same place, but to a place made new by understanding. The final gift of this journey is not knowledge alone, it is presence. The ability to stand in a field, beneath a quiet sky, and feel both the gravity of what came before and the openness of what lies ahead. To farm now is to choose again. To ask not just how we grow food, but why, and for whom, and with what cost. And perhaps, somewhere deep in the pattern of stars the hunter still watches, and somewhere in the furrowed land the first farmer still waits, and within us both still whisper, "Tend this field well. It is not just soil, it is story, it is memory, it is future, and it is yours." Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for walking this long road through the furrows of memory and the dust of time, tracing the footsteps from wild grain to field, from wandering bands to the quiet dawn of cultivation. If this story helped you feel a flicker of wonder, a pause for reflection, or a deeper question stirring just beneath the surface, then your presence here has given it meaning. Thank you for lending your attention to the slow, patient rhythms of human becoming. Perhaps a single image stayed with you, a silence beneath the stars, a seed pressed into soil, a voice calling across the centuries. Whether it was the glint of obsidian traded across valleys, the hum of grain being ground by calloused hands, or the ache of choosing stability over the open horizon, these fragments are what connect us, echoes that stitch our private reflections into a shared thread of memory. If something lingered for you, I invite you to share it in the comments, not as a duty, but as a quiet offering. These moments of reflection are what build our thoughtful little community. If you'd like to walk further with us through time, myth and meaning, you can subscribe, share, or simply wait in stillness. More stories are coming, each carrying its own question, its own light. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,